Good morning, Conference. My name is Victor Chamberlain, and I'll be chairing this item, F14, on the agenda. My aides for this session will be Liz Lynn on stage and Susan Junid in the hall. We'll start on page 22 of the agenda with item F14, Federal Appeals Panel Report. All the reports to Conference can be downloaded from the Conference pages on the party website or viewed on the app. The Federal Appeals Panel Report is on page 62 of the reports pack. I'll now ask Alan Masters, Chair of the Federal Appeals Panel, to present his report.
Good morning, Conference. Looking around the room, I can't make up my mind how many of you have been up all night and how many of you went to bed early and have got up to hear me, but however you got here, I'm very grateful you've come in to attend. Can I start by just saying a little bit, as I do every year, about the Federal Appeals Panel and its role. Some years ago, the two parties got together, the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party, they introduced into the Constitution a unique structure, in my view, of dispute resolution and ways of interpreting the Constitution. And that role is both a federal role and a non-federal role, so it raises up. The Federal Appeals Panel is the highest tier, if you like, of dispute resolution. It's chaired and administered by a group of people that you elect, this conference elects, and the body that I report to is nobody else but you in the report that I make each year. So therefore, it's really important, and I do say this and stress this again, that people are aware of the report, read it, and understand that they have the entitlement to ask questions and if there are matters of concern. I say this for very, very reasons. My role as I'm a barrister by trade, has always been to protect the interest of Conference and its members. To do that in a fair way, a transparent way, and an accessible way. The role, in a way, gives the chair and its members quite a considerable amount of power over the constitutional elements of the party and decision-making. And you are the guardians of that power. So at the end of the day, it's very, very important that people don't just think, oh, this is the Federal Appeals Panel, I can flip over this page and not have a look. Take the time when you get the agenda and you see what we've been doing over the year to read it and to make certain that you're happy with what we're doing. There's an awful amount of responsibility, and I am honoured, actually, to be able, over the last 7 years, to have done this role. In 3 years' time, I must pass it on to somebody else. And I say this to you now, you've got to make certain that the people that are in this role of responsibility do the task in the way that you would expect them to do it. And so I say to you again, when asking you to endorse the report, this year, we've made some minor amendments to various rules. I noticed that there have been no questions put forward again this year, and so that it must be that I'm doing a good job and that everybody's happy with the amendments that I've made. I just hope that's the case, and it's not the case that everybody's just flipped the page and not bothered to look. So I say again to you, in asking you to approve the report for this year, to take care next year to read it, to understand it, and remember that I am in a unique position because the only person I'm responsible to is to everybody here. So I'd ask you to endorse the report for this year, and thank you again for your attendance.
Thank you, Alan. As Alan mentioned, no questions have been submitted to this report. We will now vote on whether or not we will accept this report, Conference. Can I see those in favour of adopting the report? Thank you. And can I see those against? I think that's It's unanimous. Thank you very much. Can I thank my aides Liz Lynn and Susan Junid, and I'll now hand over to Jenny Lang, who will be chairing the next item.
Good morning, conference. We're now going to move on to the parliamentary reports. So I'm joined by Lord Dick Newby from the House of Lords, Catherine Bearder from European Parliament, and Alistair Michael from the House of Commons. So I'm going to ask each of them to come up and give you a short report back for what's been happening since the conference last met. Then I've got a couple of questions which are published in your daily bulletin. If you have any other burning questions, though, if you do want to move towards the intervention mic there, we may have time to take a few more towards the end. So do have a think, and if you do want to ask some questions, just move over there. Okay, if we could maybe start with Catherine.
Morning, conference. Gosh, doesn't time fly? It doesn't seem 10 minutes since I was last here reporting on all the work that I do in the European Parliament. But when we were last here, it was spring, we were looking at county elections, and I realised that after the referendum, our councillors and our council leaders were going to be in the front line of questions about Brexit. So I was very keen to bring them over to the European Parliament and to give them full briefings on what was happening Brexit-wise. So we did that. We had 30 councillors from right across the country came and spent a best part of a day in two chunks, spread over 2 days, looking at everything that was involved so that they were able to go back and understand that. And of course, what we weren't expecting is the general election. But we did have some PPCs in amongst those, so that was useful for them, I hope. And it did seem to go down well, so I've now invited a delegation from the Lords and the MPs, and some of the staff are coming over next week. I think they're coming to see us. We've got about 28 people coming over, and we're going to have a full briefing with all of those involved in the next Brexit negotiations. So that's quite a busy time organising these trips. But my work on the Environment Committee, of course, continues. It is the reason I got into politics is because of my concerns about the environment. And I've had quite a bit of success this year. You'll remember I reported that the cross-party group of MEPs that I set up really pushed the Commission, and they finally came forward with a wildlife action plan, not only for inside the European Union, but with host countries and countries where the wildlife is being taken from the wild and brought into Europe. And we've been working on that. We've had a couple of really good successes. The Commission have now banned the sale of raw ivory right across. It's a Europe-wide ban, and that is something really important. And the other one that we work very hard to do, Europol, the European-wide police agency, have a serious and organised crime that they have a budget for and targets for. And wildlife crime was not on that. And we had a real push, lobbying and moving behind the scenes. And we've now got a commitment to get the funding in as of next year. And that means that they will be joined up across the police forces with a focus on wildlife crime. We've already had one wonderful success of the eels, the glass eels that come from Spain. They had a big investigation, and they actually arrested people in Croatia as these eels were heading off to the east where they eat them in China. And we've also had the Chinese mission in my office, and a letter from the President that he is now confirmed. He is stopping the sale of all new ivory in China and the working of ivory, and they're shutting down ivory working factories. So some really good successes there. I also convene the cross-party group of pro-European MEPs, so we have people from the Labour Party, Greens, Plaid Cymru, SNP, and including Sinn Féin, but they never seem to turn up. Can't think why. But we are working, we're briefing ourselves on that. Our real work on the Brexit negotiations in the Parliament will happen once the deal is agreed, and then we have to approve it or we don't approve it. And as I pointed out last night, that will come before a lot of MEPs who are about to go off and be re-elected in their host countries. So that is not going to be easy, the deal that comes to us. Citizens' Rights Task Force, I've been working with other MEPs looking at the rights of EU citizens wherever they live, either in the UK or Brits living elsewhere in the European Union. And that's a really difficult issue. And they are feeling very, very vulnerable and very hard done by. Euratom is another one that I've been working on. I have the JET project in my constituency, and that is a really knotty problem. I don't know why Mrs. May put in Euratom into Article 50 letter. She wants to leave it. That's going to leave anybody who has nuclear materials, that it governs the movement of that and the inspection. So it's not just our lights, but also our X-rays and our cancer treatment, everything. And as a quester, I continue as a quester, that is looking after the interests of the MEPs in the Parliament, one of 5 of us who are directly elected. And it's interesting how that sort of trips me up every so often. I get to approve all the exhibitions that are held in the Parliament. And we had a request last week from Greek MEPs who wanted to put up some really unpleasant cartoon. It was supposed to be a history of cartoons, but it was Greeks having a go at the Germans. And I took out 18 of these cartoons that I said were not acceptable to go on the walls of the Parliament. I am now all over the Russian, the Greek, and all the Eastern press as being censorship in the European Parliament. So although I think I'm sort of standing up for the Parliament, I pop up in odd places, as such is the way of working in an international institution. But I do keep moving, keep running. I have a wonderful team of staff that keep me busy and make sure I get to the right place on the right time. So I hope that you're happy with the work that I'm doing on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Michael.
Thank you very much. Good morning, conference. I think only in the Liberal Democrats would you find that the accountability session for the parliamentarians attracted about 10% of the audience that the one yesterday morning did for the Federal Conference Committee. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first report back as Chief Whip since I returned to the role in July. And I think, first of all, I should thank my predecessor, Tom Brake, for the efforts that he made in that role. Tom, obviously being part of a group of 12, may no longer be Chief Whip, but he still has a very important role, and it's very valuable for me to be able to draw on his assistance and expertise and experience in the job. Since last we had one of these accountability sessions in York, I'm pleased to report that we have seen a 25% increase in membership of the Parliamentary Party in the House of Commons. We're very sorry that that did not actually include a number of colleagues, Nick Clegg, Mark Williams, Greg Mulholland, and of course Selah Olney, and of course John Pugh having stood down at the general election. But the arrival of a number of new colleagues has, I think it's fair to say, enlivened the group. The manner in which we are able to operate is vigorous, it is collegiate, and I think it bodes very well for the difficult times that Parliament is going to face in the months ahead. Can I just also place on record my appreciation for those who support our work in the Whip's office in the House of Commons. Jack Fletcher heads the office. In the course of this year, Joe Edwards has left our employment, but he's been replaced by Lucy Kay. Without them, it would be impossible for us to act as I hope we do, as a fairly coherent and a focused group of Liberals in Parliament. I should also actually place an appreciation to somebody who is, strictly speaking, not part of the Whip's office, but actually has been around it for so long that we feel that he probably still is in an honorary capacity, and that's Ben Williams. Ben was previously head of the Liberal Whip's office, the Liberal Democrat Whip's office in the House of Commons. He then became Special Advisor to the Chief Whip during the coalition years, and latterly has served as Tim Farn's Chief of Staff. He's moving on since Tim has left the leadership, but Ben's experience and commitment to the party has been absolutely invaluable to us on more occasions that I can actually think of. And while I've no doubt that we will from time to time call upon his advice and experience, it will be a very different group without him being around us. Conference, I think it's fair to say that the parliamentary business for the foreseeable future is going to be dominated by one thing, which is Brexit. Traditionally, a minority government will meet the challenges that it faces by doing not an awful lot. Now, that is just something which is not going to be open to this government. It's very interesting to see, though, the way in which they are now meeting that challenge is to pull as much control of the whole process away from Parliament to manage it all from Theresa May's office in 10 Downing Street. Just this week alone, we had on Monday the votes on the EU withdrawal bill, a massive power grab for the executive from Parliament, aided and abetted by their colleagues in the DUP. On Tuesday then, we saw a quite remarkable spectacle when the Conservatives, again with the help of the DUP, took a majority on every public bill committee in the House of Commons. Now, forgive me, this is a little bit arcane, but it matters. It has always been the practice that the majority that a government has on parliamentary committees reflects the size of the majority that they have in the House itself. This government does not have a majority in the House of Commons, but yet, despite that, they brought forward and were supported, as I say, by the DUP, a motion to change our standing orders to give them a majority on all committees. It's an affront to democracy, it really is. Essentially, what the Tories have just done in the House of Commons is to pretend that the general election didn't happen. They rely on a confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP, which, as Andrea Leadsom said, times without number, that they have a working majority. They manifestly do not have a working majority, and that much then became apparent on Wednesday of this week, when faced with opposition day motions in respect to the public sector pay cap and student tuition fees. The DUP, not bound by the confidence and supply agreement, because these are not confidence and supply issues, indicated that they would vote against the government. The government, therefore, would lose, so they simply folded. They didn't force a vote. The motions went through unopposed, and the government position then is that because it's not binding on them, they intend just to disregard it. Now, if the government's policy now is to disregard opposition day motions and the outcome of them in the House of Commons, then another weapon has been taken from our armoury in holding them to account. And I just draw back on my experience of time in Parliament to look at the way in which these opposition day debates have been a catalyst for very important change. The immigration status of those who served our country in the Gurkha regiment would not have been sorted but for an opposition day motion. that is the difference, and I think they do not understand the danger that they do by proceeding as they do. I would just finish with this one thought. The coming months are going to throw up a few moments, I suspect, of quite high political drama. It is for us to navigate our way through that. Whether we all agree on the detail of every policy or not, I think will probably be lost to the vast majority of the voting British public. What we will be judged on, however, is how they see us in the generality, which I think at the moment we are in a good place. We are seen as having a very strong position and identity in relation to the question of leaving the European Union, and that we should be united. Sometimes that means that we all have to come and go, we have to compromise a bit, but the maintenance of that unity and that purpose, I think, is the most important tool that we can have as a party when it comes to achieving the end that we all wish to see, which is our country to remain at the heart of the European Union. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Alistair. And it's moved to Lord Dick Newby.
Well, Conference, since the last conference in the spring, our group in the House of Lords, which of course is unaffected by little things like elections, has been doing what it always does, which is to work extremely hard to call the government to account on bills by moving and passing amendments, by asking questions, by voting on dodgy statutory instruments, and generally calling the government to account. Of course, as in the Commons, all our activity is dominated by Brexit, whether it's on the floor of the House or whether it's what's happening with our committees, and some of the fiercest criticism of the government's approach, not least on the withdrawal bill and the use of Henry VIII powers and all of that, has come from a constitution committee which is cross-party and has produced a withering criticism of the extent to which government is trying to subvert the process. And just as we have over the Article 50 bill, we will be dominated by the withdrawal bill and subsequent legislation. And it's just worth remembering that on the Article 50 bill, the House of Lords did defeat the government on a number of issues, not least on the status of EU citizens. And the Liberal Democrat group played a major part in those government defeats. On the highest vote, we had 90 of our members out of 100 voting, which in House of Lords terms is just exceptionally high. We've always got, because of the nature of the Lords, there are always a small number of people who are unwell or unable to be there. So that sort of attendance from our group is exceptional and is widely noted. In the run-up to the election, Tim Farron found himself doing any questions with Michael Forsyth, who I think it's fair to say is not a natural lover of the Liberal Democrats. And Michael Forsyth had to admit to Tim that although he tends to disagree with us on practically everything, he was most impressed by our cohesion and our energy. And it's that cohesion and energy that we hope to maintain going forward. On the Article 50 bill, in the end, we were frustrated when it came to ping-pong because other groups, particularly the Labour Party, were not prepared to keep going and really push the government very hard. And it took a former Supreme Court justice to make a very telling analogy about the extent to which they were prepared to do ping-pong. He said, I'm no great table tennis player, but my understanding of the rules of ping-pong is you don't stop the game when you've hit the ball over the net once. And that is, in effect, the rule that Labour was adopting, and we challenged and will continue to challenge. At the moment, it's very much the lull before the storm, in that we are waiting to get the withdrawal bill from the Commons, which we expect just before Christmas. And we'll then have 2 or 3 months when we will scrutinise it, and to the extent that the government hasn't amended it to give Parliament more control over the process, I'm pretty certain that it will be amended in the Lords, because one of the things I think we have been able to do, and were able to do to an increasing extent over the Article 50 bill, was draw together a cross-party coalition of pro-Europeans in the Lords, of whom there are a majority, and we'll be working hard to do that in future. This requires a certain amount of self-denial on our part, because if we're working with people, we can't at the same time be taking sight swipes at them for their timidity from the dispatch box, much as we would like to do so. So there's a certain amount of biting of lip in that respect, but it's vitally important that we work together, as we have in the past, to build and maintain this coalition, because we will, as in the Commons, be seeking to get an amendment on a referendum at the end of the process into the withdrawal bill. And although it's not absolutely clear that we'll be successful, there's a chance of a very, very good vote for that in the Lords, which I think helps to build up momentum towards that change. The other thing that we're very much conscious of is that from Easter next year, we're going to be faced with 2 very large legislation streams. One is the other 7 Brexit bills covering major things like agriculture, customs, immigration, of which the government at the moment clearly has no clear view. And on the other hand, we're going to have to be dealing with 1,000 statutory instruments that are required to implement the withdrawal bill. That's about 40 per parliamentary week. And although we won't be debating each of them in great detail, we'll be debating quite a lot of them. So there's a real ratcheting up to come, both in the Commons, but certainly in the Lords as well, in terms of Brexit stuff. And at the moment, frankly, none of us can see how the government can get that through. So I am very, very fortunate in the Lords in having a terrific team on Brexit and indeed on all the other subjects. On Brexit, our spokesperson is Sarah Ludford, and she leads a very broad team of people, whatever the subject, whether it's Robin Teverson on Euratom or William Wallace on the security implications, or Susan Kramer on the impacts of Brexit on the city. We have a team of people that's respected and feared by the government, and we'll be deploying those resources to the full. And I would just like to conclude by thanking the people who keep us in order and make it possible in terms of the staff. My Chief of Staff, Elizabeth Plummer, Humphrey Amos, Head of the Office, Sarah Pugh, who helps people with the process of legislation, Dave Shaw, who helps with our media, and Maeve Keating-Fitzpatrick, who's just joined us to try and keep us on the straight and narrow. A slightly difficult job at time, but very much worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is now your opportunity to ask some questions. We do have 2 that were submitted, which are on your daily bulletin, from Christopher Hudson and Karen Karai. I'm going to ask the panel to answer both these questions. There will be an opportunity for a supplementary, in which case if either Christopher or Karen want to ask supplementary, they can move towards the intervention mic on my left, your right. Similarly, we've probably got time to take 2, maybe 3 other questions. So if there is something burning you want to ask, to query, this is your opportunity. So again, if you can move towards the intervention microphone and wave at me once we've done these 2, then we can ask some more questions. So we're going to start with the question from Christopher Hudson. It's kind of in 2 parts, really, around a commitment to always follow up on the motions passed by Federal Conference, but in particular the motion on associate citizenship of the EU, which was agreed in York 2017. So we have a little handheld mic, so I'll leave it up to you which way you want to.
Okay. On the question, first of all, of parliamentary parties following up motions passed. I suppose I could sit here and say, yes, of course, the 15 volumes of conference motions passed is never far from my hand as I review parliamentary business. But
In your briefcase
I
at the back.
suspect that those of you who know me might understand that there's a small element of exaggeration in that. There is, in this regard, an element of balance and judgment to be taken into account. Conference does not mandate parliamentary parties. That's a quite important principle for a whole variety of reasons, not least the fact that as parliamentarians, we are there to represent our constituents primarily. And occasionally, these different competing demands can come into conflict. So that's the most, that's the broadest answer to the question. In point of fact, the fairly organic way that we grow policy in this party, I think, means that area by policy area, yes, we do what we can to follow up in respect of policy motions that are passed here, not least because as parliamentarians we are quite often, if not mostly, involved in the process that brings them to the floor of conference in the first place. We're currently talking within the parliamentary party in the Commons to our colleagues in local government about recreating a committee structure that we had in years gone by that will allow us to engage more widely, not so much in respect to the policy, because of course the party has its own mechanisms for creating policy through the Federal Policy Committee and through conference, but in terms of how we engage with the pressure groups, the NGOs in each individual area, and that we can take the policy motions that are passed as a tool for campaigning rather than as being an end in themselves. And in that regard, I would say, I think actually, and I think maybe this question has gone to every accountability session, which is a good and sensible way of doing it, because in fact, the duty, I think, is on us all to take what we decide here and to explain it, to campaign on it in our communities at every available opportunity. Now, with regard to the question on EU nationals, there have been a number of different parliamentary occasions, opposition day debates, backbench business day debates, question times, when we have sought quite vigorously to promote the interests of a proper settlement of the position of EU nationals living within the UK. When I was a member in the last Parliament of the Brexit Select Committee, I in particular spent quite a lot of time and energy dealing with that issue. So the position about EU citizenship now is one that is being progressed through an all-party effort, which is being led by Robin Teverson. Robin and I just met, I think, 3 days ago, and reviewed the progress on that and agreed some next steps. So it is actually quite a nice example of how a motion passed at conference here does inform and guide the work of parliamentarians, and sometimes it goes in ways that are not just to be found by turning on the Parliament channel and watching the proceedings of the House.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the two parts. The policy, I like the idea that I have an influence in a parliament of over 750 when I'm the only one. But let me explain really how we arrive at decisions in the European Parliament. Most of the work is done in committee, and where we have hearings and motions are brought forward and reports are discussed. But interspersed with committee weeks, we have group weeks where the decisions and the debates in committees are taken to the parliamentary political parties in the Parliament. And I sit with ALDE, that's a collection of Liberals and Democrats from across the European Union. And there we will fight out what is the position on a particular topic that's coming through from our committee. And we listen to all the committees. And we all come with our party policies. We basically are all Liberals, and so that informs us all. And we will come to an agreement on what line we will take. Occasionally, there are real lines for me, because I understand, this is what we've been campaigning on, this is party policy. I can't support that, then we will step outside of the group's vote. But we do try and keep group cohesion. So there's a lot of debate. It isn't as simple as being Lib Dem and sticking to the Lib Dem line. Often, as in life, we have to make compromises. And then when we go take the final reports to the full plenary, then we will vote there. But occasionally there are ones, and I've said, no, I cannot support that, because that goes against party policy and it goes against what I feel is right for the UK, for my constituents, and for the Lib Dems. So, in that order. Then, on the EU citizens, well, as I said, we've been doing a lot of work on EU citizens. It's almost one of those things you couldn't have made up. And if you listen to the Leave campaigners during the referendum, nothing will change for EU citizens. And I saw one, Daniel Hannan, the other day. No, it's fine. All that will happen is you won't have the title of EU citizen. Well, a lot will happen, and a lot is already happening. People are not being able to rent properties unless if they're EU citizens. They're not getting jobs now if they find that they're EU citizens. The complicated nature of families is being thrown up. Some children are born on the mainland in Europe, in Germany, in France, or wherever. Some are born here, so some of the family are British citizens, some aren't. If you are to leave after this, then you could lose any acquired rights that might come in at the time of Brexit. And the interesting thing is, if a Brit marries somebody from anywhere around the world, that is not Europe, they have spousal rights. It's not always easy to get those enforced, but those spousal rights mean that you can bring your wife or husband into the UK if you're a British citizen. EU citizens do not have that right. So if we leave without that, they will have worse rights than the rest of the world. So they didn't need them because they were European citizens. So there's an awful lot going on. The associate citizenship is an idea that has come from the ALDE group. Charles Gorin, who's a Luxembourg MEP, and Guy Verhofstadt are very keen on this, that we give British citizens some sort of associate EU citizenship if we leave. It's not getting traction, especially with the European People's Party. So we need help. We need help from you to talk to your friends and colleagues. They need to be writing to Guy Verhofstadt and to Charles Gorin. You can find all their addresses on the Parliamentary website, or to me, and we'll pass them on. The situation that you find yourself in, we've had one hearing. We're hoping to have another one this autumn on hearing about EU citizenship. The other thing that I'm really pushing for, and I don't know how it's successful, but it's not for the want of pushing, that we have a standalone agreement on EU citizens. Because the normal format in all these international agreements is nothing is agreed till everything's agreed. So it is part of the mix. It's part of the mix on Ireland, on fishing policy, or Euratom. It's all part of that. Now, if we fall off the end of the cliff at the end of March 2019 with no deal, there is no deal on the citizens either. So I'm pushing that we have a standalone agreement that is separate from the exit negotiations. We agree it, and we tie it up and have that agreement tied up and agreed. And that is separate from the rest. That is also going to be very difficult to do whilst they keep, and both sides are using citizens as bargaining chips. And I hope as so often with bargaining chips, another bigger one will come along and then they're lost. So we need your support. We need EU citizens, wherever they are, whatever their situation, to keep flagging it up, because it is absolutely vital. This is real lives and real people.
Thank you.
I think just two quick things to add. On the generality of the relationship between parliamentarians and the way we behave in party policy, it is the case, as Alistair said, that members of Parliament, particularly members of the House of Lords, tend to have been involved in every area in drawing up party policy virtually. So we are integrally involved. It's not as though we're an outpost that gets the missive saying this is what's been decided, can you implement it? You know, there's much more integration in the way that the process works, and I think we're very conscious of party policy as we decide what the stances that we take. On the associate citizenship, I don't have very much more to add, other than one of the challenges that you face in Parliament is how you actually can effect a change. We may pass a policy here, but what's the mechanism for doing it? And so on this, given that this associate citizenship will be a grant, in effect by the EU rather than the UK, the onus rests there. But we will need the UK government to support it. So, I mean, I think, for example, depending a bit where we are on the general negotiations, the immigration bill, when it comes, which will deal with all this kind of matter more generally, it'll be probably in this session will be the principal parliamentary vehicle for trying to push this. And there's no questioning, I think, that we in our group will try very hard to do that.
Thank you. Is Christopher Hudson here, and did he want to make a supplementary? No. Okay, we're going to move on to a second question from Karen Karai. So, and this is around how do we help women get into boardrooms when there are big issues with them needing to take time out of work more often around flexible childcare, etc. So, who would like to start with this one?
I'll kick off on this. I don't know that it's necessarily something that comes within the very varied responsibilities of the Chief Whip, either in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, but it is an area where we have a good story to tell. Vince, when he was Secretary of State for Business in the coalition government, gave real drive and priority to this. We saw the number of FTSE 100 board companies that were all male in their board composition fall from 21 to 1. And it's quite remarkable, actually, to see the way in which that progress has been reversed or pushed back in the time that the Conservatives have been in power on their own. So, you know, the achievements and the things that Vince did, there was a lot of support for within the business community itself, but it's clear that these are things that are not just going to happen without some proper campaigning effort. In terms of the parliamentary aspects of this, I think it is fair to say that the House of Commons has become somewhat more family-friendly, child-friendly in the years that I've been there, although, frankly, I'm always a bit wary about banding around terms like family-friendly in relation to Parliament. I don't think any Parliament that ever sits in London is going to be that friendly towards the family of the Member of Parliament for Orkney and Shetland. And, you know, you can tinker around the edges with changes to hours and increasing nursery provision and the rest of it within the parliamentary state. But ultimately, you know, we all, or certainly my family, had to accept that my absence from the family home Monday to Thursday was just going to be a feature of life as my children were growing up. We have some discussion going on within the House at the moment that when members are on maternity or paternity leave, that there will be arrangements between the whips that their votes can still be counted. So we're not quite yet clear on how this is going to work. It might be the use of a nominated proxy, or it may be some form just of nodding through. But it should mean that people are not having to come charging back to Parliament because we think that a vote is going to be close at a time when really, for a few weeks at least, I think most people would want their priorities to be a small element of family, normal family life, and being with their family. It has, you know, as I say, Parliament has made some significant progress in this, and you know, this, you come back to the first principles. How do you make these things happen? Well, actually, one of the things that has made that progress possible has been the increase in the number of women having children where they were MPs, and also younger men also being in Parliament and having to take on the responsibilities of fatherhood while being members of Parliament, and you know, in that way, having a more diverse Parliament helps make progress in all these issues.
Thank you. Got anything to add?
Yeah, as somebody, as a woman in politics, I have to say, I've always felt very lucky that I've never faced barriers. I've, you know, managed to do what I wanted to achieve in politics, despite being a woman. But I think I've witnessed that so often the barriers are there for women, and they're very difficult to identify. And we have to all work to opening our eyes and seeing what is the difficulty when you have a young family, childcare, and often you're not the breadwinner. So if you have to leave the breadwinner to bring the money in, and money is tight. Women don't have control of the purse so very often. And so I think what we've done in trying to get in more women into public life in all levels, council level or in business and everywhere else, is look at the barriers. And women on boards was a real one that we could approach through legislation, and it was one that would have a real effect on each business, because if you have women on the boards, then they're asking the awkward questions about the whole employment practice all the way down. And I'm as sorry as everybody else that we seem to be slipping backwards. But that is always the way in equality legislation. If you don't keep up with pushing it and keep monitoring it, and that's the same for racial equality, disability, whatever you're talking about, it will slide back down again. So looking at those barriers, we have to be attacking it where we can from the legislative process, but also working with those that we're bringing on and encouraging young women to think about politics when they've already got a lot of other things going on. It tends to be when they go to school and they start thinking about the future, and then they start to get angry. You know, they always say men go into politics as a career, women go into politics when they get angry, and that's certainly the case for me. But I also think we shouldn't just concentrate on young women, as important that is. But when you're a little bit older, you've probably got a bit more time. And I was 60 when I got elected into the European Parliament, and actually Shetland and Auckland, it's nothing if you're from a Finnish MEP, or even the Swedes who have to do the whole of Sweden, or some of these MEPs travel huge distances and have complicated journeys just to get to the Parliament. So I feel for everybody that has to travel that far. And then, of course, if you have children, that's difficulty. The one good thing about the European Parliament, we have no barrier to breastfeeding in the chamber. It is a very family-friendly place, and there are quite a few babies there at the moment that are either on the front or the back of their mum or their dad. So it's a good place to work.
There aren't a huge number of babies in the House of Lords. Second childhood's a different matter. There are two questions here, one about boardrooms, and there Vince used the bully pulpit of politics to really push that agenda when he was in government very successfully. The broader question has to do with how you make it easier for women to progress up the ladder from the bottom. Because unless they progress up the ladder from the bottom, they're not going to be in consideration from the boardroom. And that's where some of the changes that we brought in government, like shared parental leave and paternity leave, matter a heck of a lot. But it's also why it's very important that we keep pressure on the government to try and make sure that they properly fund the policy that they've adopted in terms of childcare. The problem is they adopt a policy but don't fund it to allow it to take effect in the way that they allege they want it to do. That's the challenge we've got with childcare at the moment, and I think that's the campaigning, the short-term campaigning area where we can help push the government into having a proper settlement.
Thank you. Is Karen here? No? Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to take one question. I think James Cole had approached me, yes. If we have quite brief answers, and then we'll move on to vote on the report. James.
Hi, thank you. I have read the reports that you all submitted, so thank you very much. I just have a couple of quick questions, one for Parliamentary report and one with regards to the Lords report. The Parliamentary report says that Brexit will obviously be the majority of the problems that we're facing, and I understand that this will have quite big problems for the devolution settlement for the various nations as well. I certainly don't intend to talk to Alistair about Scotland, but I was wondering if the Parliamentary Party had a plan to assist Kirsty Williams in putting Wales's case, as she has no UK parliamentary colleagues, and give her something to fight on in Wales. And with the Lords, I was pleased to see the figure of 500 campaign events done by our Lords over the last year, which is wonderful. I was just wondering if those would be distributed according to our vote share of the last election in the coming year, with Wales having only 4% Lib Dem votes, the majority of that concentrated in 3 constituencies. I would hope that the Lords would be willing to make a disproportionate number of visits to those in their coming campaign schedule, especially since Aberystwyth University and its very strong young Liberals are located in Ceredigion, which we only lost by 104 votes.
Thank you. Alistair?
I suppose as an MP from Scotland, who's also the Northern Ireland spokesman, when we lost our Welsh MP, it was inevitably going to come bouncing back to my desk, and so it has done. We've not yet worked out a formal mechanism for how we will make this, how we will build this into our parliamentary work, because it's not an easy thing to do. But we're alive to the problem, and I've already started speaking to peers from Wales, members of the House of Lords, to see about how we can cover some of the bases at Westminster to support our colleagues in Wales to get back Ceredigion and, of course, Brecon and Radnorshire and Montgomeryshire and Cardiff Central, and to make progress beyond that. Personally speaking, I think I've got at least 2 campaign commitments in Wales between now and Christmas, one in Ceredigion and one in another constituency I can't quite remember the name of just at the moment, but that's a reflection of how my diary is managed, which is, shall we say, light touch management as far as I'm concerned.
Well, we're fortunate in the Lords in that we do have some very active Welsh members, Jenny Randerson, Roger Roberts, Chris Humphreys, Martin Thomas, who are very keen to remind us of the importance of Wales and going to Wales. One of the challenges we have is that we can only go where we're asked. and so my request back to the parties in Wales is to put pressure on us to come and visit Wales, which we'll happily do.
Thank you.
Can I just,
absolutely.
you touched on the point about Europe taking up a lot of parliamentary time, and there is a feeling that I get in the European Parliament of huge frustration, and yet the Brits are causing us to a lot of time and effort and money negotiating with them when there are huge problems facing Europe. There are 1 million people sitting on the north coast of Africa attempting to get in. We haven't got a proper migration policy. There is climate change, we know, with biodiversity loss. We're trying to complete the energy single market, the transport networks. I mean, these are huge infrastructural issues that we have to get to grips with. And so much time is being wasted on Brexit. And, you know, for the Leavers to think that we are going to come out of this in a better situation, we are so damaged by Brexit. Even if we stay, we are damaged. If we leave, we are damaged. And that frustration across Europe, yet again, that the Brits are holding Europe up is palpable. And so, you know, we're all trying to do the best that we can in getting a good deal, but it is not going to be easy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Apologies to the additional question I couldn't take. So we are going to move to a vote now whether or not to approve the report. So if you get your voting cards ready, if you could be seated for voting, that'd be fantastic. We're going to start with the report for the European Parliament. Can I see those in favour of accepting that report? And anyone against? I'm not seeing any hands, so that is accepted. The report from the House of Commons Parliamentary Party, can I see those in favour of accepting? And anyone who wishes to reject? That's no hands, that's accepted. And the vote to accept the report from the House of Lords Parliamentary Party and to reject? All of those reports are accepted. I'd like to thank very much our panel of parliamentarians. So if you show your appreciation, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. And can I thank my aide, Chris Mains. I'm now going to hand over to the next session, which is Armed Forces Personnel. So thank you very much.
Good morning, Conference, and welcome to F16, Armed Forces Personnel, Recruitment, Retention and Welfare, which you can find on page 23 of your yellow agenda. There is one amendment, which you can find on page 3 of the daily announcement sheet, and if you haven't got a daily announcement sheet, I'm sure you can find a friendly steward who will give you one. Will Thomas Hughes stand by? And I now call Baroness Smith of Newham to move the motion.
Good morning. Fellow Liberal Democrats, the defence of the realm is the most important, the first duty of government. And this very weekend, we see yet again that our armed forces are having to be on the streets of the United Kingdom responding after a terrorist attack. It's part of a whole sequence of such events that we've seen. And on each occasion, the armed forces have stepped up. But it's not just at home they're required to do that at short notice. It is in response to international crises, as well as defence engagement. With the Hurricane Irma problems last week, we immediately saw a British response. There may have been some criticism about how long it took, but servicemen and women were ready to be deployed and were deployed immediately. Fellow Liberal Democrats, our servicemen and women give their lives to our country. They work tirelessly, very often unnoticed, very often unreported, and in some cases seemingly unrewarded. Their pay has been capped at 1%. They have issues about accommodation, about getting their children into schools. The pressures for service families are very difficult. But do we hear about that in the press or on the news? Very rarely. What we hear about are the big ticket items. We hear about the fact that there might not be enough frigates or destroyers. We so often hear Alan West pop up to remind us we couldn't fight the Falklands War today. We hear about the issues about procurement for helicopters or joint strike fighters. We very rarely hear about servicemen and women, about recruitment, retention, and how they live their lives. Even our own party falls prey to this. I discovered on Facebook this morning that exactly 4 years ago, I moved our last defence policy working paper. I spoke for 8 minutes on that occasion, 6.5 minutes on all sorts of aspects of armed forces policy and defence, and 1.5 minutes on Trident, because I knew that every other speaker in the debate would be focusing on the nuclear deterrent. And that is what we tend to do. We focus on big picture issues without remembering that without servicemen and women, there is no point in having nuclear submarines. There's no point in having the Queen Elizabeth-class carrier. There's no point in having helicopters. We need servicemen and women to man them. Without the selfless dedication of servicemen and women, our armed forces would be nothing. But they also have families, and service families are hugely important, and we very often neglect them and their importance to our overall armed forces. Over recent years, personnel numbers have been cut dramatically, and yet overseas deployments have been increased. Service families bear the brunt. Most service families accept that. They know it's part of the deal, and they're willing to accept that the nature of their life is very different from that of civilian life. But alongside that has traditionally been service family accommodation. The rules on that are changing. There is uncertainty about what's going to be meant by the new model. And while servicemen and women look forward to the flexibility of the new family accommodation model, there are concerns, because the traditional model of service family accommodation is one that allows service families to live in communities. Because if you are required to redeploy 7 times in 9 years, you need to know that there's going to be a community for you to join. You're not just having to engage with a new set of neighbours time and again who don't understand service life. The traditional model has allowed for that, because as you move, you assume your neighbours are also going to be service families. And when your spouse is deployed, you know there are other people you rely on. If you're required to go and rent in the private sector, you have none of that community. So some of the proposals that the government are putting forward are welcome, but only cautiously welcomed by many servicemen and women and their families. And fellow Liberal Democrats, a lot of the burden of activity in the services falls heavily on women. So please don't think that I am gratuitously talking about servicemen and their wives and that this is unintentional. It is entirely intentional, because we still have a situation where fewer than 15% of our service personnel are female, so the majority of spouses are women. And whereas in civilian life, we many, many years ago gave up the expectation that on marriage, women gave up their careers, or on having children, women gave up their careers. But for service families, it is very, very difficult for the spouse to have employment. It's not precluded. Legally, they can do it. But if you're redeploying every couple of years, it's very difficult to keep a job and a career going. And that is compounded by the nature of service accommodation and the maintenance provisions. For service accommodation, there is a contract. You can't just ring up the local plumber and say, please come and deal with this problem. You have to go to the service provider. You have a 4 or 5 hour wait, so you take a day off work. But they don't come and deal with the problem. They come and say, oh yes, you've got a problem. We'll send somebody out to deal with it. And you say, but I know I've got a problem, that's why I called you. Oh yes, but my job's only to tick the box. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not good enough. The government says that Career and Amy are delivering on their key performance indicators. If that's the case, the performance indicators aren't right. They need to be changed. And on accommodation, servicemen and women ought to have the sort of legal rights that people in the private sector have. At the moment, they have a license to occupy, and there is no guarantee that if they don't have hot water and if the boiler doesn't work or if the roof is going to fall down, that anything will be done about that. All of that negatively impacts on services morale, creates family pressures, and increases the danger of people leaving early. Ladies and gentlemen, servicemen and women are vital to our country and to our communities. We owe it to them to ensure that we provide for them, to ensure their welfare and their morale, and that our armed forces are as protected by us as we are by them. Please support the motion.
Thank you. Will Terry Scriven please stand by, and I now call Thomas Hughes to move the amendment.
Conference. Currently, the motion proposes a great deal of crucial measures that are overdue for our service personnel and their families, but amidst a measure that my young Liberal colleagues and I believe would greatly improve the quality of recruitment in the armed forces and the important early career experiences of potential recruits. Many things make a soldier, sailor, airman, or Royal Marine, and among these is fitness, both physical and mental. Of course, in the intense environments in which the members of our armed forces frequently operate, mental well-being is just as, if not more important, than physical. In fact, the Royal Marines run the recruitment advert, "It's a state of mind," a very clear message that the first and foremost quality they look for in recruits is in their mental framework. It's crucial that our service personnel are as mentally fit as they are physically, but we've also got to ensure that people who are genuinely capable of serving in the armed forces are not obstructed or totally excluded by arbitrary criteria. The reason I've been asked to move this amendment is because I've recently gone through the recruitment process for the Royal Navy and can happily say that I'm waiting for entry into the Britannia Royal Naval College within the next 3 years. Although in the 2 years I've spent in the recruitment pipeline, much of it spent in the medical limbo, I've experienced and heard of how others have experienced the bureaucratic nightmare that is Capita, a bureaucracy that is currently dealing with what I believe is around 40,000 potential recruits, going for jobs that require uncompromising standards of physical and mental fitness. These standards have led to Capita, the agency responsible for a great deal of the recruitment process, including the medical, to having to follow an understandably strict but unreasonably inflexible criteria regarding mental health. Recruits aren't rejected on medical grounds for superficial injuries or dependency on glasses, but the stigma around mental health that we as Liberal Democrats have rightly dedicated so much of our time to breaking down means that recruits who suffer from even minor cases of autism are permanently excluded from serving in the armed forces. The devastation of being barred from a potential career aside, if this hardline policy is quite as bad as some of us believe it might be, then it presents several huge problems that I fear I won't be able to cover in this speech, but one among them would be potential recruits not going to their GP to be diagnosed if they fear it will restrict their employability. What we're calling for is a review into the recruitment criteria for the armed forces to ensure that the current system is not excluding perfectly capable recruits based on arbitrary prejudices around mental health. We are not asking for them to... we are not asking for recruiters to allow every single recruit, regardless of any pre-existing conditions, as this will seriously hinder the operational effectiveness of the armed forces. We believe that whatever the findings of such a review may be, the clarification it would provide would improve the quality of recruitment in Her Majesty's Armed Forces without compromising their operational effectiveness and help combat the stigma around mental health in recruitment, both military and civilian. Please support the amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Will Judith Jolly please stand by? And I now call Colonel Terry Scriven from the New Forest.
Good morning, Conference. Thank you, first of all, Baroness Smith, for moving the motion in respect of the armed forces. And I'd like to thank you for your continued support that you've given over many years. I would wish to address line 50, which is about the veterans. Since the ending of the Second World War, there have been numerous attempts by organisations representing former service personnel to achieve medallic recognition by Her Majesty the Queen for their service. As each year has passed, the activities of the medal campaigns have lessened due to old age, frailty, illness, or in many cases, death. Consequently, in 2007, the National Defence Medal campaign was launched by representatives of these organisations, in particular National Service veterans, British Cold War veterans, career post-armistice veterans, those veterans involved in nuclear testing, and also submariner veterans. 7 years ago, in support of the Armed Forces Covenant, the first policy motion of our party in coalition government was to recommend a medal review to look at all these outstanding submissions and the institution of a National Defence Medal. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, promised he would establish the medal review, and indeed, in 2010, it was an election Conservative manifesto promise. The aim was to draw a line in the sand in respect of all outstanding claims for medallic recognition. And he asked, and in fact he tasked the Ministry of Defence with carrying out this review. The MOD review was shambolic. It was discredited and it was aborted, and resulted in the Prime Minister David Cameron and our Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg initiating in 2012 a fresh independent military medal review, but sponsored by the Cabinet Office, with a former senior diplomat in charge of carrying it out, and on the understanding it would be open, transparent, and consult with all the various medallic campaign groups. On the 29th of July 2014, the government, on behalf of the Honours, Decorations and Medals Committee, made a statement in the House of Lords, one day after the House of Commons had risen for their summer recess. To the shock of all the veterans, the majority of those medal submissions were turned down. The announcement was lacking in substance. For example, the National Defence Medal would cost £5 per medal. Over 7 years, and out of 7 million veterans, it would likely have 4 million applicants. The cost over 7 years would be £20 million. Both the Cabinet Office and the MOD have misled Parliament and the review and said it would be £475 million. This has been a nonsense. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to support this motion, but also support the reopening of the medal review for our veterans. They deserve it and they need your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Akuno Abassi stand by? And I now call Judith Jolly.
Conference, I'd like to start by quickly thanking those people who helped us put this motion together, and in particular, veterans and spouses of serving members of the armed forces. And it's made it seem very much more real, and it's given us a level of detail and understanding that we didn't have before. So thank you to them. This motion is all about morale, recruitment, retention, and veterans. And on the point that's just been made, I'm quite happy to commit to follow up in the House on questions about the medal issue. No problem. I'm going to be speaking in particular to lines 21, 52 and 53. The lifting of the 1% pay cap is really critical right across the board, but in particular in the armed forces. Servicewomen and men still have their bills to pay and their mortgages, just like everybody else. But what they don't have, and once they join the service they give up, is the right to lobby, to join a union, or to strike. So, conference, fellow Liberal Democrats, we shall do that on their behalf. Moving on to 52, once you leave the service, there's no way for those providing services, whether it's the NHS or the local authorities, to know where veterans are living. So what is being proposed is that in the census, there is a box to tick to say whether veterans are living in this house. So we're not asking for a particular veteran to, we know where you are, but it will allow local authorities and the NHS in those areas to determine which wards has got a concentration of veterans living in, so that they can then put services geared at veterans into those wards. So it's for planning. Line 53 is the one that offers free further and higher education on leaving the service. Now, this acts both as an incentive to join, but also it acts as a retention. And one of the things that I discovered over the recess when I spent a day on board the USS George W.H. Bush was that the Americans do something similar, but what they do is they extend this so that a serving man or woman on leaving the service can get the benefit. But if they remain within the service, the benefit can be passed over to their children. And I thought that was a really interesting idea and something that we should pursue. So, conference, this motion will help with morale. It should help with recruitment and retention. And I'd very much like you to support it. And I would also like you to support the amendment moved just now.
Thank you. Can I ask speakers, and thank you, Judith, for sticking beautifully to time, to stick to time, because we are starting to lose a few seconds every time. Will Jackie Bell please stand by? And I now call Ukuna Obasi, who was the parliamentary candidate in Walthamstow.
Good morning, conference. My name is Ukuna Obasi, and I was the parliamentary candidate for Walthamstow in the last general election. I recently applied to join the Royal Air Force Reserves as an intelligence officer. My application was rejected because I do not have British ancestry. I was a bit confused by that. So, as a naturalized British citizen, I can become a member of Parliament, become an MP, but I cannot become an intelligence officer in Her Majesty's Royal Air Force. The armed forces are not recruiting enough people, as it is, and certainly not recruiting enough people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. So to put up barriers, such as this one, is not only counterproductive, it also, in my view, discriminatory, and that is not the Liberal way. So, conference, I urge you to support this motion. the review of the recruitment process that this motion talks about will enable such barriers to recruitment, such barriers that stop people who are British, who want to serve their country, from joining. We have to make our armed forces accessible to all and allow people who want to participate to join the armed forces. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Will Ian Jones stand by? And I now call Jackie Bell from Edinburgh North East and Leith.
Conference. A century ago, my granddad was fighting at Passchendaele. An army regular, he was away from home from August 1914 to early 1919. He saw things that no young man should have seen. On return, he said little of his experience. However, he had mental, if not physical, wounds. He had periods of depression. Moreover, in old age, he feared death, of meeting those he had killed in the afterlife. Owen's powerful poem, Strange Meeting, evokes that. Fortunately, Grandad died suddenly. Years later, my son attempted suicide on return from Iraq. He had a few days in hospital and after leave returned to active Air Force service. He had available support. Although problems later in trying to join the Army Reserve because of that period of inpatient stay and problems with bureaucratic tick boxers, he is now back serving in the Army Reserve and will shortly become a major. As a social worker in a hospital for older people, we had increasing veterans who in developing dementia had traumatic flashbacks to wartime experiences. One man had recurrent memories of the Burma Railway. He needed reassurance he was in Edinburgh and not in Thailand. The impact of trauma in later life is now widely recognised as an issue to be dealt with. Times have moved on in supporting the mental health of veterans since Owen and Sassoon were treated at Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh. Along with physical health, that there is a need for much care, nursing home care for wartime veterans, we need to attend to the mental health as an important part of the military covenant. There is some good practice in the statutory and voluntary sectors. My son's a director of the Lothian Veterans Centre in Dalkeith, which offers support to men and women. From his experience, he can help and have empathy for the mental as well as physical effects. They offer signposting to funding, activities, help with getting employment. However, with the pressures of local government funding cutbacks, funding for such ventures is threatened. Therefore, Conference, we should value our veterans and offer them support, not just for the visible physical injuries, but also the mental traumas at whatever time in life they occur. Please support the motion as amended. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Isabel Parasam stand by? And I now call Ian Jones from Middlesbrough and East Cleveland.
Good morning, Conference. I speak to you today as somebody who spent 21 years working with the Ministry of Defence Service Children's Education Authority, someone who's been a head teacher of 2 service children's schools, whose 3 children have been part of service children's education, and who has 7 out of my currently standing 10 grandchildren who are either part of or have been part of service children's education in the service community. Service families have for too long paid a too high price for the cost of the defence and the safety of our country. And this motion is timely and excellent to do something about it, and I would ask you to support it fully with the amendment. Service children, service families have caught too often in systems that are unresponsive to their needs of having fast-moving changes, that respond to their fast-moving changes in their movement and their turbulence. Our changes in local government, its weakening, the changes of systems within our educational service make it even more difficult for schools, social work and medical authorities to quickly respond to children's needs and their families' needs who may be in an area for only about 2 years. They meet excellent social workers, they meet excellent teachers who are themselves as equally frustrated by the institutional failures to respond quickly and lose themselves in slow-moving red tape and then drop out of the system because they are seen as problems. This motion helps to do something to change that, and it is well worth backing. The other big factor are back-to-back tours, which are putting tremendous pressure on service children and their families. And the reason for that is we have allowed the size of our conventional armed forces to sink to dangerously low levels. We are over-reliant on the territorials, we are over-reliant on the reserves, and we are no longer in a position to seriously defend our country in the changing world and the risks that we face. And we need to do something about recruitment very quickly indeed. I ask you to support this motion. I ask you as Liberal Democrat councillors, I ask you as Liberal Democrat teachers, governors and activists, pass this motion, go back to your constituencies, identify your service families and help heroes. Those heroes include women and children of our armed forces families. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Abigail Bull please stand by? And I now call Isabel Parashram from Redbridge and Walsall North.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at conference. I stood as a parliamentary candidate in the last election, and I'm proud currently to serve as a spokesperson on Brexit for the West Midlands. I'm speaking in support of this motion, and in particular in support of line 56, which is calling for better recognition and treatment of mental ill health for veterans. In supporting this motion, I plan to share the story of Michael, whom I met through my work as a lawyer. Many of the details of this story have had to be changed in order to protect the confidentiality of all of those involved. However, the key lessons to be learned remain the same. Michael has always wanted to serve in the armed forces. It was his dream as a young child, and he was absolutely delighted when he was chosen to serve on a specialist combat unit, which would be deployed into territories overseas, areas of high conflict and high stress. This was because of his innate sense of skill and incredible sound judgment. He conducted several tours of duty, and as he explained to me, he was aware that he was experiencing situations of very high trauma, and he was failing to process many of the difficult emotions that were bubbling to the surface. He says that he masked these feelings purely through the adrenaline that he felt while he was serving. It was when he was mourning the death of a lost loved one, on his knees at a cemetery, that he finally broke down. He describes himself as a broken man with his mind in tatters. Now, there are many organisations who do wonderful work to support our war veterans, organisations such as Combat Stress, the Royal British Legion, and the Veterans Gateway. However, what I would argue is that the experiences of war veterans are particularly unique. Their past experiences of war, extended periods of time away from family, adapting to civilian life, a sense of lost identity, a lack of community ties, and in Michael's case, a self-imposed sense of isolation. What I would argue for is a better focus for frontline mental health services on triaging and signposting cases such as these, so that, as in Michael's case, he would have received help far earlier than he did. Thankfully, this story ends well, Michael's family was able to support him and encourage him to receive the help that he is now receiving. Like everyone in this room, I am sure, I applaud the work of the armed forces, and in order to express my gratitude, I appeal to you to support this
Can you bring your
motion
remarks
as
to a close,
amended.
please?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Abby Llewellyn, please stand by, and I now call Abigail Bull from Wickham.
Good morning, conference. As suggested by Joe Swinson at the rally yesterday, I am now speaking to conference for the first time. I'm in favour of this motion, and there are several areas that I could address today, but I will focus on military covenant and welfare. I hope to share with you both why and how military covenant is very important to military families, and in particular their children, who did not choose this life and should not be disadvantaged. I'm a primary school teacher, and when children move, it is generally accepted that it takes 6 weeks for them to adjust. During this time, they can be upset, they can be unsettled, and it is generally considered that their progress will stall. That's half a term, a sixth of a school year. And whilst learning is a lifelong journey, the development of the brain and its capacity to learn is crucial at this stage. So it is essential that the transition is as smooth as possible, as these children will move time and time again. I grew up as a military child. I served as a reservist whilst at university. I am a spouse to a member of the armed forces, and I have 2 children who face these challenges. Military covenant has gone some way to help, but it must go further. And we as a party must drive this to ensure equality for those children who sacrifice for our country. In the motion, education is a priority, as it should be. Lines 37 to 42 of the motion are a good start, but I don't believe they go far enough. Military moves are often very sudden. They do not fit into the administrative processes. These children must be given priority, and those managing these transitions must be given training and clear guidance to facilitate this quickly. But education is not the only challenge faced. This motion has begun to address this in lines 45 to 46, but it must be expanded. I remember my parents being unable to get us access to a dentist for 2 consecutive tours. That's 4 to 5 years without a dentist, and that is unacceptable for young children. They couldn't register with a doctor, and waiting lists do not work with military schedules. Appealing a school place and having to drive, my parents won one of those cases, and that was before military covenant. Last year, a friend did not win the case, and they now drive away from 4 schools in walking distance to get their child educated. On our most recent move, we had 2 months to relocate from the US to the UK. I had a baby, I had a 3-year-old, and we were told there was no housing, and we needed to rent privately. My husband deployed 3 weeks after we returned. This is unacceptable. I won't start to talk about Korean Amy. I don't have the time. Support for military covenant and the expansion of its remit to include healthcare, dental access, and other social provisions for all members of the armed forces and their children must be a priority, more so in the current climate. So our party must endeavour to support service families and ensure equality for these vulnerable children. Thank you for listening. Please support the motion.
Thank you very much. Will Doug Harper please stand by? And I now call Abby Llewellyn, who is going to summate on Amendment 1.
Good morning, conference. I'm also happy to be telling you that I am speaking at conference for the first time. I have just been through our mid-selection process in recent weeks, and a major part of that selection is, of course, medical. It is extremely thorough, as it should be. They need to know that your body and mind will be able to cope with military life. And when it comes to mental health, it's important that recruits are mentally robust, because being in the armed forces and going to war can be very difficult and sometimes traumatic. However, the current entry requirements don't seem to adequately acknowledge the concept of recovery. For example, at my selection, there was a woman who 10 years ago had a bout of depression because her husband died and she was made homeless. Completely understandable, right? Well, she was refused entry on medical grounds, despite being symptom-free for many years. As a side note, she was actually treated quite judgmentally by the Capita mental health staff as well. But this is where the armed forces treat physical and mental health differently. With physical conditions, there are carefully created rules and exceptions for various problems. So, for example, IBS is a condition that has the potential to preclude you from joining the armed forces. But if you haven't taken medication in the last 2 years and you are managing with an adequate diet, you can pass the medical. And so here they seem to accept that there are variations in severity and that conditions can improve. But they often don't offer the same leeway for mental health. And whilst this is somewhat unfair, that's not the only problem. This position on mental health means that a lot of people end up lying about their mental health and not seeking help, because they know it'll end up on their medical record and they'll be henceforth banned from serving in the military. This is true for both young hopefuls who wish to pass selection and for people currently serving who are scared of being discharged. And because many people are not coming forward about their mental health problems, their issues are being left untreated and deteriorating. Given that a significant number of soldiers experience mental health problems as a result of their service, this hard line on mental health conditions could be exacerbating their problems and contributing to this low morale discussed earlier, as well as the poor mental health of veterans. Meanwhile, the mental health care for these veterans is often very poor. So, however, I'm not a doctor, and that's why this amendment is only calling for a review of the entry requirements, not for a change in policy. Any final decision would, of course, have to be made by military medical professionals. Over the years, there have been a number of reviews on entry requirements. Gay people who have only been allowed to serve openly in the military since 2000, and women will be serving in infantry from next year. At one point, these groups were considered inappropriate for military life, but these policies went through review and it was decided that actually these people are perfectly capable of being good soldiers. As I said before, of course we need to be careful because recruits need to be in a position where they can cope with military life and going to war. And this review, and if the review comes back and says that actually this policy is justified for the following reasons, we would wholeheartedly accept their professional judgment. But I do believe it's important to have this review to ensure that the entry requirements are appropriate and not a result of outdated, stigmatising and simplistic view of mental health. So I'm encouraging you all to vote for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Doug Harper, who's the last speaker in this debate, who will summate on the whole motion. While he's coming to speak, can I ask that you have a look at the words of the motion on page 23 of the agenda and the amendment on page 3, and get ready to vote as soon as Doug has finished speaking. Is Doug here? Can somebody else summate if he's not here?
Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't intend to come back to the platform. I was giving my card to one of the excellent speakers. This has been an absolutely fantastic debate. Like Judith, I would like to thank the people that drafted the motion. In the past, I have chaired numerous party working groups on security and defence, and we tend to get bogged down with high-level stuff. On this occasion, we had people who have been involved in service life, giving content, helping us draft the report. And the speeches today have also given a whole set of issues that we need to think about as a party, and which I believe Judith and I can continue to raise in Parliament. I talked a lot about accommodation, but we've heard also about selection, and the idea that somebody cannot be in the intelligence corps because their ancestors weren't British strikes me as deeply abhorrent. It also strikes me as very strange. How many people in the United Kingdom can actually say their ancestors were British? So I think that needs to be thought about a little bit. And clearly that's an area where we should be pressing the government, looking for answers and effecting change. Access to medical care, access to dentists, access to school places are all hugely important, and I'm incredibly grateful to Abigail for raising some of those issues that I didn't go into in the opening discussion. but they are important. We will raise them with government, and we will keep pressing to ensure that the issues that are being raised on a daily basis within the forces are actually raised to the highest level with ministers, because it is so important. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to think about servicemen and women. We need to think about veterans. As Judith said, we will look into the medals question and lobby the government yet again about those, but also the points about mental health for potential recruits, for serving personnel, and for veterans are hugely important. Retired servicemen and women are disproportionately represented among the homeless. That shouldn't be the case. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have all agreed that it's important that we do the right thing by our armed forces. Please support Amendment 1 and support the motion as I hope it will be amended. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for filling in for the missing summator. But we now move to 2 votes. The first vote will be on the amendment, which is here on the daily announcement sheet. So can I see all those in favour of Amendment 1? And those against? I think that's carried, I think, with nobody voting against. And then can I see all those in favour of the motion as amended? And those against? Yeah, I think, again, that's carried with nobody voting against. Can I thank my aide? Can I thank my aide, Alex Hagenbarth, and apologise to the 8 people who, unfortunately, we didn't have the time to call. Thank you very much and enjoy the next debate.
Good morning, Conference. We will now start the next debate, which is F17A, opposing Brexit. Unusually, you will not find this motion in your printed agenda document, but you will find it in today's conference daily on page 3. That's where the motion is set out. There is one drafting amendment to it on page 5, which will not be separately debated or voted on, and there is Amendment 1, which will be separately proposed and debated and voted on at the end of the debate. I will be taking interventions at about 11:30, and I'll give you more details as we get closer to that point. I have to say I have had about 4 times as many speakers' cards submitted as I will be able to call, so I'm afraid not everybody who has put in a card will get called to speak this morning, I'm afraid. But I do now start the debate, so could Tom Brake please stand by, and I now call Stephen Crocer from Camden to propose the motion.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Conference. I'd like to start by extending my thanks to all those who have been instrumental in bringing this motion before you today, to all those who stood up and lent it their support during its various stages. This motion is described as the opposing Brexit motion. However, it is much more than that. It is about our position in the world. Whether we are open and welcoming or closed and inward-looking, whether we are able to live in one country or 28. It is a motion that sets out our commitment as a party to stand up for our beliefs, to do what we feel is right for generations to come. In short, I am calling for the adoption of a policy by the Liberal Democrats to withdraw Article 50 should we find ourselves in a position to do so. This policy is no small thing. It is a motion that again places ourselves on the right side of history, as we did with Iraq. Some of you will greet this idea with hesitation, others with optimism, but by standing up against the wanton economic self-harm already being committed by Theresa May's government, we place ourselves on the right side of history and of our collective consciousness. The question that the referendum brought us was one of political mandate. It was a vote where every vote counted equally. However, we live in a parliamentary democracy where a government seeks to be elected on the basis of its policies and its manifesto. No government can bind a future government, and in the same way, in our democracy, no referendum should be able to bind all future governments if that future government has been elected on a clear manifesto commitment. In this instance, it would be the Liberal Democrats' commitment to withdraw Article 50 and remain in the EU if we receive the mandate via a general election to withdraw Article 50, and it would be entirely democratic to do so, on the basis that past votes or past governments cannot bind future ones. If it is argued that a referendum creates a stronger mandate than our current parliamentary system, that in turn must be an argument for a new, much more proportional voting system. This year, the Liberal Democrats, I outlined a commitment to offering the public a chance to vote on the terms of any deal with Europe, while the Conservatives spelled out a vision of a chaotic Brexit on the basis that no deal is better than a bad deal, and Labour struggled to define any position on Brexit. The Liberal Democrats offered an alternative choice, but it failed to resonate. The amendment to this motion is a repeat of our general election position. It takes us nowhere and should be rejected. Many of you will have campaigned hard for Britain to remain in Europe. The result was a personal body blow for me and many in this room. The world I want my three daughters to grow up in is not one of splendid isolation, but of magnificent connection, with all the benefits membership brings. We can see the sad impacts that last year's referendum have already had on Britain, both socially and economically. The fall in the pound, the regular news of the likes of Toyota, the banks and many other businesses considering their options to move out of the UK, all in the light of a possible crash out of the single market. Socially, we see our friends leaving, or we see them looking over their shoulders. There is increased anxiety, increased fear, starkly seen through the prism of hate crime statistics since the vote to leave. But it is wrong to assume that the Brexit vote was caused by a single factor. It is my view that there are many underlying causes of Brexit: the dissatisfaction within the English heartlands, the lack of hope and even identity. Therefore, the Lib Dems, in tandem to our opposition of Brexit, must spell out a positive vision of the future. Vince Cable, our new leader, is beginning this process. A vision that addresses the concerns of those left behind communities across the UK that have too little to feel positive about and plenty to feel aggrieved about. A vision that puts England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland back on the map with both identity and purpose, confidence and capability. A vision that addresses the industrial mismanagement that goes back decades over successive governments, from allowing our industry to become uncompetitive in the 1970s and destroying it in the 1980s, using North Sea oil revenues to pay benefits rather than committing to retrain and reinvest. It is the responsibility for us as a party to include in our manifesto those ideas which are fundamental to our ideology, to our reasons for being. And it is the responsibility of voters to make their own decisions on whether they agree. This is the cornerstone of democracy, and a party which fails to express its own views, a party which fails to offer a real choice to voters at the ballot box, is the champion of democracy no more. By pledging to revoke Article 50, the Liberal Democrats will find ourselves on the right side of history and the right side of democracy. If the government of the day refuses to grant voters the right to decide for themselves whether the deal is good enough for them, let us grant them that choice by presenting a different path in our manifesto. In the general election this year, I stood in Holborn and St Pancras against Sir Keir Starmer. He was a staunch Remainer, but now sometimes advocates the single market and the custom union, sometimes not. It is said in politics that there are signposts and there are weather vanes. Weather vanes spin off in all directions with the winds of public opinions, while signposts remain true to their beliefs. I am calling on Conference to make Lib Dems that signpost. Conference, I ask you to look outside, peer into the landscape of politics in Britain. The wind is blowing and the Labour weather vane is spinning, fanned by bitter divisions within the shadow cabinet. I say today that we will stand firm and we will be a signpost in a nation of uncertainty. Now is the opportunity to stand up for your children, for your grandchildren, for the hopes and dreams of thousands of EU citizens who came to this country on a platform of optimism to build a better life and to help build a better Britain. I call upon you all, support the motion, reject the amendment, which seeks to relegate us to the status of a spinning weather vane, and to make a stand for what we believe in. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And could I ask Louise Morales to stand by to speak next? I now call Tom Brake to propose Amendment 1.
Thank you. Conference, I'm speaking in favour of Amendment 1. Now, in relation to the motion, lines 1 to 40 and 44 to 45 are fine. They are entirely consistent with what we have been saying as a party since the EU referendum. It's lines 41 to 43 and 46 to 48 that are a problem. And the problem is that if the motion is passed unamended, the Liberal Democrats would be saying, first of all, that government should reverse the Article 50 decision, which incidentally, of course, Parliament voted for in a majority, and Parliament should then overturn the result of the referendum without the need for a referendum on the deal, which has been our policy since shortly after the EU referendum and was endorsed by Vince last night. A conference, we all hated the way the campaign was conducted, with lies and gross exaggerations on the Leave side, and indeed perhaps a few minor exaggerations on the Remain side. And we probably all agree that using a referendum to try and take a decision on something as critical as this was foolish. And we know that David Cameron took that decision simply because he wanted to pander to the Brexit wing of his party. But the referendum did take place, and it had the highest turnout of any election since 1992. And since, we have been consistent in saying the only way we could change direction would be after receiving the seal of approval in a referendum. If we don't follow this path, we open ourselves up to a charge of seeking to deny democracy, the enemies of the people, in the words of the Daily Mail. Construing the result of a general election as a democratic mandate, as the motion suggests, does not have the same legitimacy as a referendum. Conference, we've just had a general election which our Prime Minister tried to construe as being about Brexit. It ended up being about the dementia tax, school funding, and whether our Prime Minister was willing or not to engage with voters during that campaign. Yet supporters of Brexit have praised the result in their aid and claiming its outcome supports the case for a hard Brexit. So it's very difficult to argue that that election result has supported the case for a hard Brexit. We certainly wouldn't agree with that, but clearly that is the point that supporters of hard Brexit are making. So, Conference, please support the amendment. It restores existing party policy. It makes clear we are campaigning for an exit from Brexit referendum. It widens the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds whose futures were have been denied by the result of the referendum. It gives EU and UK citizens in the UK and in the EU respectively a vote on something that has upturned their lives, and we will continue to campaign for Britain to remain part of the European Union. Conference, the referendum on the terms of the deal policy has stood the test of time. It's helped attract tens of thousands of members to our cause, and in my view, is the only way of turning around the 23rd of June result, which commands sufficient democratic legitimacy and clarity. Vote for the amendment and then the motion as amended. Thank you, Conference.
Would Kamran Hussain please stand by to speak next? I now call Louise Morales. Louise is a councillor from Woking and wishes to speak in favour of the motion.
Hello, thank you. This is my first full conference, first chance to speak. I am a councillor in Woking. Woking is one of the most diverse constituencies in the country. Certainly it is the most diverse in Surrey. We have wards where 98% of the children starting school speak English as a second language. We have 60% of the population of the whole town were actually born in England, which means 40% weren't. Significant number of them are EU voters, are EU residents with non-British passports, and they are all up in the air thinking, do I go home? Do I give up my job when it's at the end of a one-year contract runs out, or shall I take another one-year contract? And a significant number of staff have already started leaving. The local economy is already suffering. The banks, we're a commuter town with about 80% of the wealthier areas dependent entirely on the City of London. And the banks are already moving their staff abroad. People are being offered the opportunity, as soon as they want to move to Paris or Frankfurt or somewhere else abroad. I have clients, I'm a gardener, and some of my wealthiest clients half of my wealthiest clients have already left the country because of the uncertainty that this referendum has left us with. If we have a policy that says there will be another referendum, it still leaves uncertainty. It still leaves all those people unsure about what we stand for, because we might stand for another Brexit vote. People don't understand it. People don't understand whether it's a hard or soft Brexit. I've got 26 years of knocking on doors for the Liberal Democrats over the many, many elections I've helped with, and the last one, nobody understood the difference between hard and soft Brexit, other than the very, very, very politically astute who've already made up their minds who they're voting for. But the 80 or 90% of the population who aren't really sure who to vote for, you talk about hard Brexit, they don't understand. So we need to have a firm, decisive policy. If we say if we get into power, we'll stop Brexit from happening, that is something that the less bright readers of the Daily Express or the Sun or the Daily Mail will understand what we stand for. And a significant number of them voted for Brexit thinking that they were going to get £350 million for the NHS. Actually, they're beginning to realise they're not. They're beginning to realise the austerity is actually getting worse because of the Brexit vote. The inflation is massively impacting on the very, very poorest because food is going up faster than anything else. Personally, I have a brother who works in Amsterdam. My husband's sister lives in Tenerife. Will they be able to travel freely after Brexit? Will they lose their jobs? My husband's sister married a Spanish person and now has Spanish residency, and so she won't be able to come back to this country to visit her elderly parents in England. So we've got all these fears, and we need to be able to say to our voters, come the next election, whether it's local elections, county elections, or general elections, this is what we stand for. Please support the motion, and particularly vote against the amendment, because the amendment puts another referendum back into the equation, and another referendum will just muddy the waters. People don't know whether that actually means we're really against Brexit.
Thank you very much. I must ask you to resume your seat now. Thank you. Would Tim Farron please stand by? And I now call Kamran Hussain, who is from Dewsbury and is Brexit spokesperson for Yorkshire and Humber, and wants to speak for Amendment number 1.
Good morning, conference. This is also my first time of speaking at conference, so please do go easy on me. Thank you. I had the privilege of leading the Yorkshire and Humber Lib Dem EU referendum campaign, and during that campaign I had the privilege of speaking to many 16 and 17-year-olds who were wrongly denied their right to decide their future. We live in a democracy, and we should be able to give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote and make a decision on their future. As Brexit spokesperson for Yorkshire and the Humber, I have spent a lot of time trying to speak to people who want to leave. I've explained to them, well, Boris has helped a lot by making false claims, but I've explained a lot as to why the lies that they were told, they should have another opportunity to overturn their minds and change their minds. Yes, we have problems to overcome, but I'm confident by giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, by speaking to people, by carrying on putting the case that Britain was, is, and will continue to be better off in the European Union. I strongly believe that over time we can win the hearts and minds of people, and if we win the hearts and minds of people, we can have a successful second referendum. So I urge you, conference, this morning to continue with the party policy line and to support the amendment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cameron. Would Adam Hanrahan please stand by? And I now call to the platform Tim Farron, and if you need me to tell you who he is, then you're in the wrong hall.
Thank you, Conference. Good morning. Look, when I became your leader, I had one mission: to save the Liberal Democrats, to fight for our very survival. A year later came the heartbreaking referendum defeat, and our mission doubled in size: save the party and keep Britain in the European Union. Our position, calling for the people to have the final say on the deal with the option to remain, was the thing that saved and invigorated our party, giving us our purpose. But what about the second part of our mission? Are we serious about keeping Britain in the European Union? I mean really serious. I mean deadly, practically serious. If you are, then you pass this amendment and you recommit to our plan to call for a referendum on the final deal. However we describe this motion unamended, saying that Parliament can annul Brexit, not the people, will be seen as two fingers to the people. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves that a Liberal Democrat majority will give electoral legitimacy to that, unless, of course, we have just undergone a dramatic conversion to the wonders of first past the post. If we want Britain to remain in Europe, and I am desperate for Britain to remain in Europe, then we need to face one clear fact. The only way we are staying in is if the British people decide that is what they want. There is part of me that says that if I never see another referendum in my life again, that will be too soon. But what started with democracy last June must not end up with a stitch-up. Not a Brexit stitch-up, and not a Remain stitch-up either. Not if you don't want your country to be poisonously, dangerously riven for generations. We will not remain in the EU by treating our friends and neighbours who voted leave like idiots who simply need to apologise for their idiocy. Our one chance to remain is if we change the hearts and minds of the people. So here's the question: do you believe we can do that? If you do, then let's get to it. If you don't, then by all means reject the amendment, back the motion alone, and feel good about your purity as we drop out of the European Union. You see, do we fear the horror of Brexit, poverty, insecurity, loss of power for Britain? Do we value Europe's peace, prosperity and security? If we do, then we have no right to opt for feel-good purity. We have a duty to our children to actually change the direction of this country. Amend this motion. Do not lecture our country. Inspire it. Lead it. Save it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Would Richard Turner please stand by? And I now call to the platform Adam Hanrahan, who is a councillor from Sheffield and wishes to speak against the motion as a whole.
Thank you, Conference. When I first put in a speaker's card for voting against the motion as a whole, I hadn't seen the amendment, so I urge you to vote for that. Also, I didn't expect to follow the barnstorming Tim Farron, so bear that in mind when I talk to you now. Now, I was born in London and am a 22-year-old Liberal Democrat councillor for Sheffield Hallam. I am about as lean remain in Connect as you can possibly get, so don't misconstrue what I'm going to say. But a process was undertaken, and the process is important. We're constantly told in training sessions at Conference, don't talk about process, voters don't care about it. But actually, we started with a referendum process, and we have to finish with one, because Brexit voters aren't stupid. People that read The Sun and the Daily Mail aren't stupid, and we cannot sneeringly say Brexit is bad because it's Brexit, which almost always seems to be silently followed by a, well, duh. People get things if you talk to them, when you explain to them, but also when you make an emotional connection to them. That's the thing we have to do to people that voted Brexit in 2016 if we want to reverse this decision, and we should want to reverse this decision because it is and will continue to be catastrophic for our country. We cannot go around telling these people, you got it wrong, do better next time, we know better. And that is what this motion does unamended. What it does is say that people in Westminster know better than people on the street, and that isn't right. We are a party, a liberal party, which trusts and empowers communities and people, and that is what underpins our party. I am not a Liberal Democrat because I'm pro-European. I am pro-European because I am a Liberal Democrat, because I am internationalist. I look at the problems that face our world, and I see that they can only be solved by working with others. And I think it is only by working with the communities that voted Brexit, by talking to them, by helping them to understand and getting that message across that a referendum on the vote, the exit from Brexit deal, that we can help achieve the right outcome for our country. Vince has been very clear and was very clear last night. We cannot become UKIP in reverse. We didn't lose in Sheffield Hallam because we weren't pro-European enough. We lost the most passionate pro-European in Parliament because our party was devoid of a wider message, because we failed to deliver hope, because all we said was Brexit is Brexit, and that is bad. Brexit is bad because it costs poor working people in this country higher food prices, higher interest, all sorts of things which make their life worse. We can, if we support this amendment, continue to support the people of this country to make a better decision next time. Not because they're stupid and got it wrong last time, but because they and we need to avoid the catastrophe, which is the cliff edge which is coming. Vote for the amendment, Conference, and then vote for the motion as amended.
Thank you. Would George Potter please stand by to speak next? I now call to the platform Richard Turner from Bath. He is going to speak for the motion as a whole.
This is my first conference and I am a new member. Although now retired, my background is in manufacturing industry and I have traded all over the world in high added value machinery. I was also a member for 6 years of the Joint Foreign Office DTI, as it was then, British Trade International, now UKTI, responsible for government promotion of exports and inward investment. I would like to address the current government policy on foreign trade and the ostensible Tory belief in free trade. It is strange that as a first step, this involves leaving the largest free trade area in the world, with the inevitable and disastrous destruction of vital supply chains that support our own industries and those of our EU partners, in the motor industry and the aviation industry, for an example. The CBI, the TUC, the EUEEF, the IOD, and the British Chambers of Trade all wish to stay in the customs union and the single market permanently. This abdication, which is based on the right wing of the Tory party's ideology rather than reality, and this is meant to be compensated by new foreign trade agreements with such countries as China, India, and Japan, the last two of which are some of the most protectionist economies in the whole world. As the EU has negotiated all our foreign trade agreements for years, we now have negligible expertise in this area. Foreign trade agreements are two-way instruments that require both parties to make concessions to get an agreement, and this usually requires lengthy and complicated negotiations lasting a number of years. Another example is the fate of our airlines that can currently fly anywhere within the EU and fly to the rest of the world under EU-negotiated bilaterals. We will now need to negotiate new agreements with every single country to enable even British Airways to fly to New York, Argentina, or Japan, for example. This is absolute nonsense. Although the Labour Party has recently shown signs of some sanity, they fought the election on a hard Brexit agenda. The silly man who leads the party has always prided himself on putting his principles before expediency. And in this case, expediency won as he tried to mop up the dying UKIP vote in his Labour heartland. Now, the current situation with the government, we are led by a foreign secretary who is a buffoon and a liar.
I'm sorry to stop you at the start of sounds like a good anecdote, but I'm afraid your time has come to an end and I must ask you to wrap up there.
I support the agreement. We have a trade secretary who is a goat in fox's.
Thank you. Would Liz Webster stand by? And I now call George Potter from Guildford, who's going to speak against the amendment.
Good morning. Conference. Do you believe Brexit is a good idea? Is there such a thing as a good Brexit deal? Do you believe, as Tim said, that Brexit will destroy public services, drive up the cost of living for the most vulnerable, and leave Britain diminished and irrelevant on the world stage? Yes. And what do you want a manifesto to say? What do you want a Liberal Democrat government to do? Because that's what a manifesto is for. It is saying, this is what a Liberal Democrat government would do. It says we will have proportional representation, House of Lords reform. And we both know that the odds of that happening in the next couple of years is pretty slim. We're probably not going to win the next election by the biggest landslide in history. But we should still make it clear what we stand for. That is what this amendment and this debate today is about. Now, a lot of nonsense has been said, I'm sorry to say. The second referendum, having a second referendum, is already party policy. We had a general election a few months ago. That was our policy then, and it will still be our policy if we pass the motion unamended. And I have no objection whatsoever to what the amendment says, because this motion is making new policy. Now, what the amendment adds is fine. By all means, let's refresh our commitment to a second referendum if we need to. The problem is what the amendment deletes. It is a wrecking amendment. The key bit which gets deleted by the amendment is a bit where we say that a Liberal Democrat government would have a commitment to reverse Article 50 and remain in the EU. Now, it is absolutely right that in a democratic parliamentary system, that if you elect a majority Lib Dem government, that means we have a mandate to implement our manifesto. And if you vote for Lib Dem MP, you should know what you're voting for. There is no need for the amendment. And I know people say this amendment is disrespecting the will of the people. It's not. We can pass the motion unamended and it will not change our second referendum policy. The question you have is should our end goal be a second referendum or should our end goal be staying in the EU? If we have a second referendum and people vote once again to leave, do we say, okay, we are now the party of leave? No, we must always be the party of remain. We must be honest, clear and principled. We must have a simple policy, a simple goal that we can explain on the doorstep. I will not take lectures in what is the best policy from the people who came up with the election slogan, look left, look right, get hit by a car. Now, we have a choice. Do you choose that our policy, our goal, our principle should be to oppose Brexit come hell or high water, or should we equivocate? Should we have a contradictory, messy policy? Please pass a motion, support a second referendum, and reject the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Michael Mullaney please stand by? And I now call next Liz Webster, who is a candidate from Swindon North, and she's going to speak for the motion.
Hello, conference. This is my first time speaking here and my first time at the conference. Lovely to see you all. I am the hardest Remainer ever, and I've been knocking on doorsteps in Swindon, which is Brexit capital practically in the country. I am not scared of the will of the people. Why are we scared of them? You know, I respect the law. I respect democracy. We have a parliamentary democracy. The referendum was advisory. The fact that David Cameron fudged it by saying and trying to scare people, well, I'm not scared of that. I'm standing up and saying it's advisory. If that dodgy bill had been put to Parliament before the referendum, what would have happened to it? That's the question I ask you. That bill there was no healthy debate around for any length of time in Parliament around that bill. It was just fudged through on the back of the will of the people. Well, let's stop being scared of the will of the people, because I can tell you now, in 5 or 6 years, if we do Brexit, the will of the people will be coming to us and saying, why the heck did you not tell us what was going on? Or why did you not stand up for this? As well as, if we let this situation continue, the Conservative Party, especially with this massive power grab in the repeal bill, will be able to fudge through anything in the shortest bills possible. And where will we end up in 10 years' time with this sort of policy? So I believe we need to be clear and turning around and saying, let's vote again at the end of the deal. Will we get a deal? Will there be time for us to vote if there is a deal that mysteriously appears? And at that point, will Europe want us back? Will they say, well, actually, we've eventually got to the end of this deal, and we've done all of this, and we say, oh, actually, we changed our mind, we want to come back, and say, well, you can come back, but you have to accept the euro, you have to accept Schengen, and it's toxic. So therefore, I think we're best to be clear and bold. We remain, we'll do whatever we can to remain. If an opportunity for a referendum arises, great, but we don't know what's coming next. So let's just be strong, remain, we'll do whatever, we'll grab whatever safety cord we can that arises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before the next speaker starts, I want just to say in a few moments we will have some interventions. So could I please ask the following people to go to the intervention microphone, which is over there, and present themselves to the steward. Please, Daniel Norton, Joe Toovey, Nigel Jones, Roger Roberts, Sarah Brown from Manchester, Chris Durham, Andy Cook, Stuart Redaway, Graham Bishop, and Lisa Smart. Could I please ask Julian Huppert to stand by to speak in a moment? I now call Michael Mullaney from Bosworth.
We want to remain in the European Union. We know that leaving it will be an economic disaster, and we know that the Leave campaign was won on a false prospectus. The question for this debate is, how do we go about ensuring that we achieve that goal of staying in the European Union? Our case has been that we should have a second referendum. Every day it becomes apparent that the case put by Leave was a sham. We were told there would be 350 million extra for the National Health Service. We were told that by the leaders of the campaign that the negotiations would be simple. We were told by the leaders of the Leave campaign that a deal could be achieved easily. It is now apparent that those claims were totally false. And if Theresa May delivers a hard Brexit, if we leave the single market and crash out without a deal, it will be an economic disaster for our country, especially for many people who voted Leave because they were told it would be to make them better off. What happens when those things that the government has been spending money on, often encouraged and often developed by us Lib Dems, to keep wages rising, increasing the income tax threshold so people are still getting regular pay rises, raising the living wage, funding tax credits? What happens when the government says, because of this disastrous economic policy, we no longer have the money to give you another income tax cut or raise the living wage? or keep paying tax credits because we haven't got the money. People will be angry when the economic effects of a hard Brexit are apparent, and they will change their minds. People can and do change their minds. What was the opinion poll support for the Iraq war in June 2003? It was 70%. I don't think you'd find 70% of people supporting the Iraq war now. People change their minds. As the great economist and liberal John Maynard Keynes said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?" And when the disaster of hard Brexit becomes apparent, it is clear people will support remaining, and it will be easier to win a second referendum. The challenge of changing to the new policy is that 3/4 of constituencies voted to leave, including over 90% in the Midlands. If we go in on that policy, we will be putting a weight around the legs of candidates in 3/4 of constituencies who will vote to leave because they'll be told they were ignoring the will in their own constituency. The best approach is to understand and accept that Brexit is going to be a disaster, that people can and do change their minds. We're Democrats, we're Liberals. Let's keep pushing for that second referendum. Let's have it, let's fight it, let's win it, and let's deliver what we want to deliver, which is a Britain remaining in the European Union, because it's better for our country, for prosperity, for peace, and better for the continent of Europe. Thank you.
Would Vera Hobhouse please stand by? And I now call to speak Julian Huppert from Cambridge.
Thank you very much, Conference. There's a lot to be proud about at the moment. I'm proud to be a European citizen and to live in Europe, and I want to keep doing that. I'm also proud of this party. Proud this party was prepared to agree to have this debate and to hold such a wonderful debate with views from each position. Which other party would dare to do this and give its members a say? I'm also proud that, unlike the other parties, we are united on what we want to achieve. We are passionate pro-Europeans. It's written into our constitution. It's something we will continue to fight for. Unlike the others, Labour ripping themselves apart, not quite sure which side to be, only knowing they want to be on the winning side after it's all over. Tory Remainers abandoning their principles because they quite like the chance that maybe sometime they might get a job under this Prime Minister or a future one. They are split. They are ripping the country apart because of their divisions. They're taking out their problems on the people around the country who deserve better. We stick together. And while we debate, we do stand together. We are united in what we want to get to. We just disagree about how to get there. And I'm proud that we're a party that is happy to do that. Conference, to me, it comes down to whether this conference should be clear about our objectives, which is to stay in the EU, or to spend our time talking about a tactic. A referendum is a perfectly good tactic to solve this current mess. I don't particularly like referenda. We've seen the problems they can do, but it's an okay tactic. It's not a second referendum. It's either a first one on the deal or it's a third one. Let's get the numbers right. It's a perfectly decent tactic. But this conference shouldn't be just about setting the tactics. It should be setting the vision, what we're trying to get to, and then let people like parliamentarians get on with the details of the tactics. So vote for this motion, and by all means, yes, if a referendum is the way we solve this problem, that's what we do. But our aim isn't to have a referendum, it's to stop Brexit and get out of this mess. Thank you.
Would Richard Flowers please stand by? And I now call the Member of Parliament for Bath, Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Conference. Across Europe, people gather every Sunday in many different cities for the pulse of Europe. People gather to celebrate what is good about the EU: peace, friendship, prosperity. And in Bath, we celebrate the pulse too. And as we march through the city with our banners and our flags, we chant, what do we want? Remain. How do we get it? The will of the people. In June 2016, the will of the people was narrowly to leave. In June 2017, at the general election, the will of the people was expressed in a different way. The Conservative Party lost its majority. People can change their minds. People, both Leavers and Remainers, can change their minds. And we must give people the opportunity to change their minds. We can only do that through a referendum. Now I'm in Parliament, I see the arguments from the Conservatives firsthand. When they say the will of the people, which they say all the time, they only talk about the will of the people as of June 2016. Last week, Conservatives and the European Parliament voted to transfer powers from Parliament to ministers. It was often referred to as Henry VIII's power. The bill was correctly labelled as a power grab by ministers. It is an attempt to implement the will of the people as the Conservatives understand it, and to stop Parliament and the people changing their mind. It is clear that this current government will struggle to change its mind, but the people are starting to change their mind, and we see that in Bath through our street stalls every week as we talk to dozens of people. So our call for an exit from Brexit referendum is the only way to unblock this debate and to understand properly the will of the people. I therefore support the amendment, and I hope you will too. Thank you.
Thank you. After the next speech, we will have the interventions, and I now call Richard Flowers, who was the parliamentary candidate for Macclesfield.
Did you join a political party to change the world? Or just to ask if someone else wouldn't mind changing the world for you? I want to remain in Europe. Julian wants to remain in Europe. Thousands have joined this party who want to remain in Europe. And we've always said we would campaign to remain in Europe. So let's just say it. If we get a Liberal Democrat government, and the way things are going, let's not rule anything out. Do we really want to finish the job of negotiations just so we can ask people to vote them down? And frankly, if we get a Liberal Democrat government, the people will have spoken. We've allowed ourselves to be frightened. Yes, frightened by anti-democrats who have used the word democracy but have contempt for what it means. That referendum was an affront to democracy. Vote Leave have admitted they only won by lying. And what they've done since, silenced internal criticism, savaged judges in the press, suborned or succoured the official opposition, suspended the rules of Parliament. It would make a dictator blush. It is time we reclaimed the word democracy. It is time we took back control. Democracy means giving people a choice, not passing the buck back to the people. We lay out our position, the people get to decide. They can choose Brexit, or they can choose us. It's got to be that simple. I'd like you to vote for me so that I can ask you to vote again, and I'll ask you to vote my way again then. I can't be the only candidate who found that a hard sell. And not a particularly honest one. I will stop Brexit. If I have to, I will spend 40 years getting us back into Europe, and then I'll build us a better Europe when we're there. That's more honest. I want to change the world. I want to give people back their future. Conference, don't amend the motion. Vote for it as it stands.
Thank you, Richard. We will now take the interventions, and the first speaker after that, could I ask to stand by, is Paul Fisher. But now we have the interventions, and first up is Daniel Norton from Bedford.
Conference. Outside this room, outside the Westminster bubble, people don't know what we stand for. That is, the problem that we have to deal with. Our values are that we're an internationalist, tolerant society that wants, opportunity for everyone in our country and across the world. And we need to stand up for that, and we need to make sure that people understand that that's what we stand for. And talking about process is not the way to do it. We want to make very clear what our values are, and whatever process we need to go through, we will take. But the outcome we want is to stay in Europe, and if you vote for us, that's what you're voting for.
Thank you very much. Could we now have Nigel Jones from Newcastle-under-Lyme to speak next, please?
Thank you. I want us to stay in the EU and work with our neighbours to improve the way the EU works. There is merit, some merit, in Tony Blair's recent suggestion of qualified restrictions on freedom of movement. Likewise, to control immigration to parts of the UK, providing support for the people who have always lived there. People's fears must be addressed. Then there is the need to have stronger moves to ensure the EU abides by the statement written in all of their treaties that decisions be made as close as possible to the people. I urge you also, please, to support Amendment 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, can we have Roger Roberts, who comes from the Aberconwy branch of the House of Lords?
Thank you very much. This is not my first conference. I don't know if anybody else was in Buxton in 1954. If they were, can we have a chat? But first of all, very briefly, things have changed since June the 23rd. You have President Trump in America. You have the aggression of North Korea. And this is, in an unstable world, the most irresponsible move that Britain could take would be to come out of Europe. We need to be at the heart of Europe. And the heart of Europe, we'll be able to influence and hopefully secure a more peaceful world. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Next is Sarah Brown from Manchester.
Conference. Last weekend, I was at the March on London. People marched for an exit from Brexit, not the opportunity to vote for an exit from Brexit. Referenda are a breeding ground for uncertainty and instability. Are we committing to negotiating with the EU until 2019, hoping for a deal so bad that people will vote against it? Tim, I have a message for you. If we want Britain to stay in the EU, then we stop it. No further referendum, just a strong message. My party will stop Brexit. Let there be no more uncertainty about that.
Thanks. Next we'll hear from Chris Durham from Market Harborough.
Hello, conference. It's my first time of speaking. We can all agree on one thing. Brexit is deeply emotional on both sides. We may all say, I think this about the EU, I think that about the EU, but really deep down what we're saying is, I feel this about the EU. We all agree on our position, mostly, on how we feel about the EU, with tweaks here and there. And that's why I would recommend that we vote for this motion, but we also vote for this amendment. There's a very good reason for that. If you want our job to be the job to potentially frustrate democracy and to ignore the process, and the process is important in our democracy, that process right now that the Tory party is ripping apart piece by piece, then we just become the opposite mirror image of them. That is not who you are. That is not liberal, and it is not democratic. We should have a second referendum, and we should fight for our membership in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy Cook from Wantage.
Hi, conference. Andy Cook here. First time here at conference, so be gentle. What are we committing to if we vote for this without the amendment? Taking a win as a democratic mandate. It's not going to be a majority. We need to take Theresa May's seat to get halfway to a majority. That's not happening. We might, just might, be kingmakers, and we would be expected to follow through what we've committed to. So what happens next if we do that, if we pull that off? What's the happy ever after? Tim Farron had the right of it. He may be the king of the dad dancers, but that man knows his onions. we would give truth to the Brexit claim that the governing class ignores the will of the people and just forces their desires on the country. It doesn't matter that it's well-intentioned, it doesn't matter even if it's the right thing to do. A benevolent tyranny is a tyranny. That is not who we are. We are the Liberals. All the fissures, all the divisions.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid your minute's come to an end. Stuart Redaway from North Hertfordshire and Stevenage.
Lines 9 and 10. Cooperation on climate change is vital. I would include staying in the ETS, the European Emissions Trading System, whether we're in or out of the EU. Lines 22 to 36. The Tories should be condemned for ideological objection to the ECJ. The ECJ is not evil. Even if Brexit happens, keep the ECJ where it is pragmatic to do so.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Next is Graham Bishop from Bexhill and Battle.
Conference. A couple of facts to illuminate this debate. We have wonderful news. Unemployment rate is the lowest now for many, many years. There are only 1.5 million people unemployed. But there are 2.5 million EU citizens here employed. So just think about what happens. We've heard the litany of them, the news about them, some of them leaving. If many of them leaving, if half of them leaving, we don't have the reserves of people to replace them. That means the labour shortages we're already seeing will become endemic. That is extremely bad economic news. That is exactly why Brexit is going to be an economic catastrophe. So I would urge you to vote for this amended motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Councillor Lisa Smart from Hazel Grove.
Thank you, Jeremy. We Liberal Democrats have a long and proud record of being right and early. Conference, we are in grave danger of acting like the hosts of a wonderful party. We have decorated the venue, we have got lovely floral displays, great catering, we've invited our friends, we've invited some people who are not our friends. And when the guests start arriving, we march off to the other side of town for a more radical party. We are in the right party. We are at the right party. Please amend this motion.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And finally, Joe Tooby from West Hertfordshire.
Hello? Sorry. Hello, Conference. I'm very nervous. I'm a first-time speaker. Okay. Do you support our party's policy on proportional representation? Yes. When we win a Lib Dem majority government, would you expect our parliamentarians to vote in favour of proportional representation? Yes. Because we had a referendum on that a few years back, and I remember it being the will of the people, quite a lot of the people, that we keep first past the post. But we don't want that, do they? We want to stand up for our principles and tell the country that if they vote Lib Dem, they will get a fairer electoral system. Do the same on Europe. Stick to our principles on Europe. Let the voters trust us on Europe. Vote against the amendment and for the motion. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you to all our intervention speakers. It was great to hear the phrase, "This is my first time speaking to the Liberal Democrat Conference," so often. Could I ask Catherine Bearder to stand by, and I please ask now Paul Fisher to speak, who is Chair of Brussels and Europe Liberal Democrats.
This is my first time to speak. I joined the Lib Dems on the 26th of June last year, never having belonged to a political party in my life. I joined as a result of the referendum result, the advisory referendum result, and I have been confirmed in my choice with the way that advisory referendum result has been interpreted by our present government. I joined because I'm liberal, because I'm democratic, but I'm also quite radical and progressive. I'm the chair, as you've just heard, of the only local party outside the United Kingdom. We have 1,500 members, 1,300 of which have joined in the last year, entirely as a result of the policy that this party has publicised. However, there is a problem, and one previous speaker has alluded to this, and that is that the message may be clear to the echo chamber here, but it's not clear to those outside the party. Are we for remaining in the EU unequivocally, not as a tactic, but as a strategy and as a vision, or are we not? That is the question. For me and the people whom I represent, the Britons who live in Europe, and, by the way, are part of that so-called 1.2 million people who will be affected by what happens at Brexit. And by the way, we've already been affected. All our incomes have already dropped by 20%, and we haven't even got to Brexit. So this is a heartfelt cry to support this proposal, and I slightly regretfully say, and oppose the amendment. And the reason for that is that we must, as other speakers have said, look at this as an existential question. This is a very important debate, certainly for those of us who live on the mainland. This is about our vision, our long-term vision, for where we see this country to be in the future. I have no difficulty, and there are those better qualified than me, to talk about the tactics of getting to the point where we remain or stay in the European Union. In fact, we should be at the heart of Europe. We should be at the centre of what is happening in Europe, as is our traditional role in the world. So I accept that there are some bumps on the road, but...
Thank you very much, Paul. Your time's come to an end. Can I ask you to wrap up? Thank you very much. Would Liz Lynn please stand by, and I now call Catherine Bearder, Member of the European Parliament.
Conference, you may remember my flag-waving days from the EU referendum campaign, and you may remember me campaigning with members of and the public up and down the country, passionately arguing that Britain must remain part of the EU. You all know just how hard that result of the referendum has been for all of us, and for half the country, and it certainly has depressed me. So why am I supporting Amendment 1? Because, Conference, I may well be known as a staunch European, but I'm also a Liberal Democrat. And the key is in the name, Democrat. On the 23rd of June, we didn't get our own way. We cannot ignore the fact that we lost. It's not unusual for Lib Dems. We've done that a few times. But this has left us with a very divided country, and we cannot ignore that vote, however much we disagree with it. We now have to work from where we are, just in local elections. If you don't win, you carry on and you go to the next election. And in order to stop this country leaving the EU, and that is still our aim, as a Lib Dem, we still and always will believe that we should stay in the EU, and we will work to keep the UK as a full member of the European Union. But we will only do this by winning the arguments, not by rejecting democracy. We cannot ignore voters, and we cannot ignore that the country is still very divided. There must be a chance for the voters to choose on how to proceed. In the last election, few voters had grasped just how bad Brexit was going to be. But as more and more people feel the effects and how and where it is going to hurt, our calls for a vote on the terms will gain the traction. That's why we must stick to the path we've chosen. There must be no U-turns, no turning back. We must fight to keep this country a member of the EU, and so our commitment to a vote on the terms of the deal allows us to own the democratic argument. We are allowing people to really take back control of the debate. It has to be the voters who decide if the negotiated deal matches their vision for Brexit. And it has to be 16 and 17-year-olds and overseas voters involved in that as well. It is the only way to reunite this country. That's not all. The amendment still allows us to campaign for the exit for Brexit. And the ballot paper must include the option to remain, meaning we can continue to work to reverse Brexit by a plebiscite. That's voters in charge. That's democracy. Conference, I urge you to stick to the path that we are on now, which is our unique position. Please support Amendment 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Sarah Brown from Cambridge please stand by? And I now call Liz Lynn.
I have campaigned on our policy for a second referendum on the final deal over the past few months and indeed for quite some time, because I thought it was a way of achieving what we want, which is to stay within the European Union. Unfortunately, it was not properly understood by a large majority of the electorate. I had many people on the doorstep saying that we just wanted to rerun the first referendum and didn't understand that it would be a referendum on the outcome of negotiations. The majority of our members, unlike other parties, are united over wanting to stay within the EU. We want to stay a member, whichever side of the argument in this debate we are on. And we want to stay a member for all the reasons we've set out over the last few years and that are reiterated in this motion. What we have to decide today is how to present our message to the electorate. That is what this debate is about. I believe it is now time for us to be absolutely clear that what we stand for as a party. We are European and we are internationalists. As Vince says, we want an exit from Brexit. Many people have been talking about, heard us talking about a soft Brexit over the last few months and have become totally confused about our position. Some think we're happy to come out of the EU if we stay in the single market and the customs union. That is not the case, as we know. And it's not possible to do that without freedom of movement. We must be honest and clear and say we want to retain our membership of the EU, full stop. I believe it is possible before the negotiations are finished. Some say that Article 50 cannot be revoked, but that, in my view, is not the case, and in the view of many former colleagues across the EU. Of course, it looks likely that the 27 other countries might have to agree. But to those of you who say Article 50 cannot be revoked, I would say to you, so what is the point of another referendum anyway? It would be the same thing of revoking Article 50 and having a second referendum. I initially had some concerns about lines 46 to 48, as it seemed a bit presumptuous to talk about a Liberal-led government when we're not exactly riding high in the opinion polls. But having looked at it again, I realise what we are saying is that if we go to the country in a general election with a clear, transparent policy, we would say, if we obtain power, we would see it as a mandate to revoke Article 50, and it couldn't be clearer. And, of course, it's in line with our parliamentarians voting not to trigger Article 50 in the first place. I'd like you to bear that in mind when you vote. Vote for the motion and against the amendment.
Thank you. Could I ask Keith Melton to come to the speakers' table at the front of the hall, please? Would Mingus Campbell stand by to speak? And I now call Sarah Brown from Cambridge to speak against Amendment 1.
Good morning, Conference. This year we had a general election. Our flagship policy going into it was essentially the one that the amendment tries to reassert, that if in government we would carry on negotiating Brexit until at least March 2019, 2 years after the Article 50 invocation, while employers and jobs flee the country, while our friends and neighbours born in other EU countries suffer xenophobic hatred and discrimination, while the pound crashes and while talent flees our NHS. And then finally, when we've negotiated a deal, we will hold a referendum and ask the electorate to reject that deal. Bizarrely, the voters didn't think that was very good. And as a result, we got our lowest vote share in decades. What appeared to be an attempt to appease people who would never vote for us anyway made people who might have voted for us instead put their trust in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour to defeat Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn, a man who could probably shoot EU migrants in Trafalgar Square and not lose a single one vote amongst his adoring voters, was seen as more credible on the EU than we are. So let's be clear, conference. The referendum policy has been tested in a general election and found to be electorally toxic. It is a failed policy, and we should abandon it. What we should do now, and what we should have done in the first place, is stand on our principles. It was Charlie's principled stance on Iraq that made me become a Liberal Democrat in the first place. I admired that, and it is time to stand on our principles again. Instead, we act as if the support for the European project written into our constitution is something we are vaguely embarrassed about, and we wonder why nobody will vote for us. Many of those representing us at Westminster still want to cling to the failed referendum policy, a policy that even Tom Brake suggested was foolish, even while asking us to re-endorse it. If I never see another referendum again, it will be too soon. They are where representative democracy goes to die. They are popularity contests for extremists and demagogues. They bring out the very worst in our politics. Things got so bad last time, so bad that an MP was assassinated. Our parliamentarians need to end their love affair with them and do their jobs. The final deal referendum policy sounds like it was born in the Westminster bubble. It was only ever going to appeal to people who think inside the Westminster bubble. Today, a few hours train ride away from Westminster, and that's where this referendum policy, our very own electoral suicide note, should be laid to rest. Because if it isn't, we will be. We should be proud of who we are. We are Liberal Democrats. We believe in the European Union. Vote for us and we will exit from Brexit. Reject Amendment 1. Pass the motion unamended. Let's stand on our principles again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would William Barter please stand by to speak next? I now call Mingus Campbell to speak.
I campaigned in the first referendum to ensure that the United Kingdom remained within the European Union. I have never wavered at any time in my political life from the point of view that membership of the European Union is fundamentally in the interests of the people of the United Kingdom, and supporting Amendment 1 does not detract from that in any way. I share the passion and frustration of so many who've spoken in relation to the principal motion. But we've got to be concerned not only about avoiding principle for process, we've got to be concerned about strategy and outcomes. And which do you think is more likely? Forming a Liberal Democrat government or winning a referendum in association with members of other parties who, like us, believe that the best interests of the United Kingdom are to remain in the European Union? I tell you, go outside and ask Ladbrokes what they think, you'll get a pretty clear indication. Why should we fear the circumstances in which we would be able to demonstrate to the people of the United Kingdom in very practical terms that the deal which has been achieved
is wholly against their interests. The motion is right to set out the defects, the consequences which have occurred even since the commissioning of Article 50. And I want to point to one in particular to which reference has already been made. Boris Johnson didn't campaign as the blonde conductor on the bus about the depreciation of the pound. But the depreciation of the pound has led to a rise in the cost of living. It's led to increased inflation, and it almost certainly will rise to an increase in interest rates, probably by the end of the year. If ever there was a strong weapon in our armory to say to people, this is what the efforts of the government to take us out of Europe cause, with all sorts of unseen consequences to follow. Philip Hammond said, I don't often quote Philip Hammond, but since this is the 35th time I've addressed the conference, I think on this occasion I may be allowed a certain amount of license. He said the people of the United Kingdom did not vote to leave in order to become poorer, but they are becoming poorer. And when the whole weight and understanding of that is put before them, then I have every confidence indeed that if the deal is not good enough, the people of the United Kingdom will reject it. And that is why we should support Amendment number 1.
Thank you. Would Niall Hodson please stand by, and I now call William Barter to speak against the amendment.
Hello, Conference. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to speak in this debate. It's my first time speaking to our conference. But I'm amazed at the idea that MPs voting in Parliament after an election mandate can be considered undemocratic. I have spent nearly 30% of my adult life living and working in France and Switzerland. I am, to quote the Prime Minister, a citizen of nowhere. I have experienced firsthand freedom of movement and the importance of the EU and the EEA. But the EU is more than just a collection of rules. It is a project of freedom, democracy and liberty written into our party's DNA. We are committed by our own constitution, I'm going to quote it here, to promote the free movement of ideas, people, goods and services. And then a little later, within the European community, we affirm the values of federalism and integration. These are strong and important words to stand by. The Brexit vote was a sad day. Bad for what we believe in, bad for our country. But at that moment was a ray of light. By opposing Brexit, our party found new members who believed in our promise. We told them, and here I quote The Independent 2 days after the vote, our first reaction was brilliant. We said that if elected, we would set aside the referendum result and keep Britain in the EU. Hope was offered in the darkness, and the motion continues with this hope unequivocally. It makes clear where we stand. Goodbye to the opportunity to parody our position, that the Lib Dems want to cut a deal to remain in the single market, then campaign against their own deal, and then presumably to be in favour of Remain if that referendum is lost. The motion puts our principles first. The amendment jeopardises this clarity. We heard already that we need to be thinking about strategy, about what we are presenting to the people. The amendment returns us to the muddled thinking, where the vehicle, a new referendum, is more important than the goal, which it has to be, keeping us in the EU. And that goal is important. It's too important to not care about, because leaving the EU, and that's only if we leave it, will damage our NHS, it will halt growth, it will hurt jobs. So, Conference, please vote for the motion and reject the amendment. Let's put our principles and goals front and centre and offer them to the electorate in the general election. Let's be ourselves, let's be what we believe in. Let's back ourselves and the European Union project. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Michael Taylor please stand by, and I now call Niall Hodson to speak against the motion.
Hello, Conference.
I'm going to speak against this motion, particularly if it's unamended. I should say I'm a Liberal Democrat from Sunderland, so I'm used to being on the unpopular side of an argument. Now, for voters in Sunderland, this issue at the centre of this motion, Article 50, is a settled thing. They have had a referendum on Brexit. They have had a general election where Brexit was front and centre. They have seen Parliament pass Article 50. They don't want to go on about this issue, and they will not listen to me as their local candidate when I speak about it. To keep banging the drum says to them, I'm not listening. And to have Democrats, Liberal Democrats, in our name, but to be ignoring the ballot box, to be ignoring Parliament, says to them that our party is not listening. Conference, this horse is dead, and we cannot keep flogging it. We need to be pragmatic. There are arguments we can make with other parties to protect the single market, to protect the customs union, to protect freedom of movement, but we can't do this with an amendment or with a motion like this. Now, locally, I think, really, in lots of regions around the country, this issue is making us a single-issue party, shackling us to one policy, which has now defined us for a considerable amount of time, and you may have noticed, is not massively popular. Now, drawing out everything else that we're about, it's making it hard to get across our arguments about education, about the NHS, about social care. We are the Brexit party, and that's making it very difficult for me, and I'm sure lots of other of you, to put the National Party in our focus leaflets. I have to say, I'm not happy with this motion, and I must call on Conference to vote against it. It is self-indulgent navel-gazing of the highest order. To say we haven't been pro-European enough is absolute madness. To say bang the drum louder. If we're a moderate, pragmatic, democratic party, and if that's what you support, I urge you to reject this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Sarah Ludford please stand by to speak next? I now call Dr. Michael Taylor from Calderdale.
Conference. I'm certainly not a first-time speaker. Plebiscites, which is another word for a referendum, are the tools of demagogues and dictators. Not my words. They are the words of Margaret Thatcher. Such a pity, then, that her successors didn't understand that, or indeed the movers of this amendment. Plebiscites have been used for years by people like Hitler to give his party unlimited power and to crush opposition. Brexiteers are now using the last plebiscite to do just that. And I don't think this party should be helping them to do it. We are a parliamentary democracy. Decisions in our country are made by Parliament, not by plebiscite. The only reason we've ever had them in the UK is because first Labour under Wilson and then the Tories under Cameron didn't have the guts to make decisions as MPs and chickened out of it. Whatever happens in these negotiations, the ultimate decision will need to be made by Parliament, not by a plebiscite. Now, as Democrats, we ought to be instinctively against plebiscites. In my lifetime, there have been 3 national referendums, 2 on Europe and 1 on the alternative vote. There have been 6 regional polls on devolution or independence. In each and every one of those, with the possible exception of the first European referendum, the vote had absolutely damn all to do with the question that was on the ballot paper. The recent in-out plebiscite on the European Union was such a tissue of lies that it has no meaningful result. Can anyone believe that a further referendum on the EU will be any different unless Parliament is prepared to circumscribe what people can say, to set thresholds and turnout levels? Then there is no reason to believe that the campaign will be conducted with any more regard from the truth than the last one. So I urge you to reject this wrecking amendment. Now,
can I ask you to wrap up now, please? Your time's come to an end, I'm afraid.
We need to stop being frit of Brexiteers and stand up for democracy.
Thank you. Can I ask Jassim Al-Kanani to stand by? And I now call to speak Sarah Ludford from Islington.
Thank you, Jeremy. As I proved with my 60s music choices in the disco last night, I'm an oldie. All my 36 years in the party have been spent working in one way or another for the UK in Europe, and I'm not frit of Brexiteers one little bit. Even when I was an Islington councillor in the 90s, and yes, Kath Pinnock, I am a member of the marvellous 50-year-old Association of Liberal Democrat Councillors and Campaigners, I managed to get a European flag hoisted on the roof of Islington Town Hall, and that was when we were still in opposition. We all agree on the objective of exit from Brexit, but the amendment affirms, in my view rightly, the position we put in place under Tim Farron's leadership 15 months ago, was incorporated in the manifesto and which has proved both durable and sustainable. We are the party of Remain. We are campaigning for that and we will always do so. Secondly, going off a cliff edge in hard Brexit would be a disaster, and so we have a responsibility to try and avoid that. That is not working for soft Brexit. Thirdly, we want the voters to get the democratic choice to decide to remain once they see the real shape and content of Brexit. This is not a reverse or rerun, and in my view, it's a political mistake to use those terms. There is nothing weak or flimsy about our existing position as reflected in the amendment. It is strong, resilient, and distinctive. We have been pretty lonely in calling for a referendum on the Brexit deal, which, by the way, we never made the mistake of calling a second referendum. Other people are coming on board, and so it seems pretty unwise now to junk a policy whose popularity is rising. Critics say it wasn't a magic bullet in the June election. True. And it may be that we are the tortoise, not the hare. But remember, the tortoise won. Support the amendment.
Thank you. Would Jill Brinkworth please stand by to speak next? I now call Mr. Jassim Al-Kanani from Harrow to speak.
Good afternoon, conference, as it is now. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I am speaking in favour of the motion and against Amendment 1. I think we've made it very clear as a party that we are the party of the European Union in a way that the Conservatives and the Labour Party can no longer be. From my point of view, I've watched in the past couple of weeks Theresa May and Boris Johnson set out a position of being two rather bizarre archers trying to fire the proverbial apple off the head. I've been reliably led to believe by my dad that my surname translated means Arisman, Bozeman or Archer, so I'm kind of glad I'm not on the Tory side at all on that one. In terms of why not Amendment 1, I have to draw attention in terms of the legalistics to the idea of free movement and the hard-won rights that have come as a result of our incorporation of the EU treaty into UK law since 1972. It underlines everybody's free movement, not just of their person, but of their goods, everything. It's their entire lives. It means that if you want to, as an EU citizen, pack up everything you can into a bag to avoid persecution, you know, you've got that point of entry here. You've got the ability to underline the rights that we have as EU citizens. In terms of the amendment, it waters down our entire position on that. It does. It quite simply has that feel that we were once the party that had the European Union at the very heart of our manifesto. It says that we will ask again and then ask again before actually guaranteeing that we are the party of the European Union. In terms of the rights of gay and lesbian people, particularly since 2013, EU law has done so much to incorporate the rights of the individual, and to ask under a referendum, which is a completely different scenario from what happened in Ireland in terms of same-sex marriage, it's not something that's comparable. We should reject the amendment and support the motion. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Alex Cole-Hamilton please stand by to speak? And I now call Jill Brinkworth from North Hertfordshire and Stevenage.
Conference. Bonjour. Guten Morgen. Buenos dias. Ciao. My name is Jill Brinkworth. I'm a newbie. I'm a first-timer at conference. It's getting a bit repetitive, but never mind. I'm also a professional translator, and I'm on the board of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting. I support the motion unamended, and I'm going to tell you why. Translators and interpreters play an important role in facilitating cultural exchange and helping to disseminate scientific knowledge in the various EU countries and further afield. They translate not only words, but nuance, not just meaning, but mentality. And that's something you'll never get from Google Translate. Their work gives them a privileged access to the mentality, attitudes, worldview, and beliefs of other nationalities. Cultural exchange and an understanding of the viewpoints of others is an important contributor to the 70 years of peace that we've enjoyed in Europe, while conflicts continue elsewhere. It's something that's also been facilitated by the Erasmus Student Exchange Programme, for example, which has allowed young people to live and study in other countries. I fear that Britain's participation in the programme is unlikely to survive Brexit. The insights I have gained through my work as a translator leave me in no doubt that any flavour of Brexit will leave the country impoverished, both culturally and economically, and will undermine its standing in international circles. Liberal Democrats must not shirk from articulating this. The prospect of Brexit has also left many of my colleagues here and in Europe uncertain as to their future. I'll give you just one example. A British translator who lives and works in France. She's married to a Frenchman, and they have a child together, as well as his 2 children from a previous marriage. After Brexit, they expect to endure more complicated visa arrangements and the inconvenience of separate gates at UK immigration. But what worries my colleague more is the prospect of the Front National gaining power and separating her from her family if she doesn't take French nationality. She already has nationality of Europe. Brexit has left her feeling dislocated and a citizen of nowhere, and I feel the same way. These problems affect not just my colleagues, but thousands of other EU citizens who have taken the opportunity to make a life in another country.
I must ask you to wrap up now, please. Thank you very much. Would Ryan Mercer please stand by? And I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton to summate the debate on Amendment 1. Alex is member of the Scottish Parliament for Edinburgh Western.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, Conference. This has been a passionate debate, and it is clear that unlike any other political party or movement in these islands, we are wholly unified in our desire to remain in Europe. My European identity is something I treasure with all of my heart, and I reflected that in my first speech to the Scottish Parliament. That fell on a day last June ahead of the referendum, and that marked an anniversary for my family. On that day, 100 years previously, my great-uncle, a 23-year-old private in the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles out of Saskatchewan, was killed, along with 80% of his battalion on the first day of the Battle of Montserrat. His name was Alexander Bennett, and I am named for him. A generation later, that sacrifice was matched by the passing of 2 of my grandfather's 4 siblings, again on European battlefields, this time in World War II. And I think at a measure, Conference, of the success of this European project that I am only the 2nd generation in the recorded history of my entire family to never have to contemplate war against our European neighbours. It is a comfort that I would extend to my 3 children and theirs to come. So I understand where that passion comes from on both sides of the debate. Now, like you, as a Liberal Democrat, I know a lot about losing elections, but the morning of the 24th of June is the darkest I have seen. I wept bitterly. And I have spent every subsequent morning seeking a way back, working to shift the needle of public opinion in our favour so that government will be forced to unpick the tethers of Brexit. But there is a process to that, and that process is almost as important as reversing Brexit itself. Irrespective of how you thought it played out in the general election, our policy to give the British people the final say on the terms of the Brexit deal was the right one. And with every day that passes, more and more people are waking up to that. A process begun by the will of the people can only be undone by the will of the people. Now, some of the speakers who have risen in support of the unamended motion would like to infer that it doesn't in any way stop that commitment to give the final say to the British people. Well, be in no doubt, it will do exactly that, and I fundamentally disagree with that approach. I support the retention of our referendum policy for 3 principal reasons. The first involves a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine a parallel universe where Remain had won narrowly last year. David Cameron, who's still Prime Minister, by the way, is addressing a conference in Brighton where, utterly slave to the pro-Brexit wing of his own party, he now faces a motion he's powerless to resist, calling for him as Prime Minister to trigger Article 50 irrespective of the referendum result. What a travesty of democracy that would be. Secondly, there's a very important Scottish dimension as well. In the days after the independence referendum and subsequently after the Brexit referendum, a wing of the SNP and some high-ranking members of the SNP talked about a unilateral declaration of independence because they felt that the people had been lied to. Now, we saw that off twice, but changing our position in this way would fundamentally undermine our ability to do that again. And finally, I speak to that principle which is at the heart of liberalism, that belief that power should lie with the people. Now, the people can make mistakes. We make wrong, collectively bad decisions, and we elect governments that sometimes harm us. But ultimately, when credited with the facts, we must trust the British people with the maturity to decide the direction of this country. So our challenge must be to dispel the myths of the Leave campaign, to spell out the full, hideous calamity of Brexit, and then to ask the people, in the solemnity of the polling stations where this first started, is this really what you meant? And if not, then you should have the option to remain. Conference, they were lied to before. Let's not now cheat them of the chance to change their minds or presume to change it for them. Please support Amendment 1, and if it falls, reject the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan, can I ask you to hold just for a moment? Conference, I have received a request to suspend standing orders. The procedure for this is well set out in conference rules, that some of you know well. The procedure for this is that I will read out to you the very brief requests I've received, and we will then have a short vote for those of you who would like to say you would like to see a short mini debate on whether to suspend standing orders, and we will have a speaker for suspending standing orders and a speaker against. And I will now read to you, and we will then have that vote. So the request to suspend standing orders comes from Keith Melton from Newark, and it says, briefly suspend standing orders to call for separate vote on lines 1 and 4 in hope of effecting compromise. That's the total of what I've received. I will now ask, in a moment, I will now ask those who would like to, I have read out what has been put in front of me, and that's the way that the rules work. I'm being told it was lines 1 and 4 of the amendment. Read it again? Sure. So it's from Keith Melton from Newark, and the wording is briefly suspend standing orders to call for separate vote on lines 1 and 4, we understand, of the amendment, in hope of effecting compromise. So, okay, I will do that. I will read out lines 1 and 4 of the amendment. You will see this on page 5 of the blue Conference Daily document. So, an Amendment 1, line 1 says after line 39, insert. And line 4 says delete 1, 2, and 3, brackets lines 41 to 48, and insert. If you want to know more about that, you will have the opportunity for the proposer of the suspension of standing orders to explain to you what it is he wants to do. So, in a moment, I will ask those who would like to suspend standing orders so that we could have a quick vote on whether or not to do as he wishes. And I will ask those in favour of that to vote and those against that to vote. And if more people vote in favour of having that mini debate, we will have that mini debate. So, yes, we can. I'm clear on what standing orders said, so I'm clear we can do that. I've read out to you the request to suspend standing orders in pursuit of a separate vote. Could I see those put their hands in the air who would like to have a short mini debate on whether we should suspend the standing orders? Thank you. Could I see those against suspending standing orders? That is very clearly defeated, so we are not going to suspend standing orders. Ryan, thank you very much for your patience. I now call on Ryan Mercer to summate on the motion as a whole.
I want to thank everyone who's contributed to this debate. I think looking at the sheer number of people who have come here today and the quality of the debate we've had, we were clearly right to hold this debate. And as Julian said earlier, I honestly cannot hope to remotely summate half of what's been said by so many fantastic speakers. So, here we go. I think I want to start by agreeing with Alex in that this debate is not about the goal. We are united behind Vince's aspiration to achieve an exit from Brexit. This debate is about the means of achieving that. So whichever way you vote on the amendment to this debate, I want you to be proud in supporting this motion as a whole, because we as a party are clearly united behind that single goal. I think I want to start by respond to Tim and the comments he made. Just over a year ago, following the referendum, Tim spoke to The Independent and said, "The Liberal Democrats will fight the next election on a clear and unequivocal promise to restore British prosperity and the role in the world with the United Kingdom in the European Union, not out. If you agree with us, join us and help make this happen." Tens of thousands of you heard that and did join us. Many of you are in this hall tonight. Tim's vision of carrying on the fight against Brexit was heard, and it is something that we need to live up to. Tom talked about the election that's just passed by and all the issues that were in play in that election. But the voters in that election were clearly moved by Brexit. They was voters who voted for UKIP in the past, many to the Tories to ensure Brexit happened. Many people moved to Labour, thinking that Labour offered the best chance of stopping Brexit. Brexit is the biggest issue facing our country today, and to suggest that that is not what will be shaping elections, I think is inaccurate. And I think it's important that we make clear. Voters did not know to come to us because we were not unequivocal in our position. They were unable to say definitely if they wanted to see an exit from Brexit, go vote Liberal Democrats. Since Tim's very bold vision following the referendum, we have muddled and moderated ourselves and confused our position. Some have expressed concerns about the timing of our position, and both Michael Mullaney and Sarah Brown invoked the example of Iraq in different ways. I'm not big on heroes, but if I had one in politics, it would be Charles Kennedy. Charles decided at the time of the Iraq War, when the vast majority of the public were in favour, that what was the right thing to do was to oppose it. Not because it was popular, but because it was the right thing to do. And many people, and over time, once the calamity of Iraq unfolded, people saw that he was right and overwhelmingly supported him. Because I want to finish by stressing again that we are, I want you to come away from this debate being proud that we are Europeans, that we are a pro-European party, and that we are the only way to achieve an exit from Brexit is by voting Liberal Democrats. So pass the motion, amended or not, but go out there and take this issue to the doorsteps and rescue our country from this calamitous Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all our speakers. And again, I apologise to all the many people who put in speakers' cards that there simply wasn't time to call. We will now move to votes. In order for your vote to be counted, you need to be sitting down. So if you're not currently sitting on a chair and you wish to vote, please go and find one. We will have two votes. Firstly, we will have votes for and against the Amendment 1. And then following that, we will have a vote for or against the motion as a whole. Could I please see the hands of those who wish to support Amendment 1? Thank you very much. Could I see those against Amendment 1? That is very clearly carried. Could I therefore please see those in favour of the motion now as amended by Amendment 1? Thank you. And those against? That again is very, very clearly carried. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to my aides, Zoe O'Connell and Victor Chamberlain in the hall. And I now